The day Earth lost its shadow. The moon was full that night, so perfectly round, so pale, so silent, yet something was missing. When telescopes turned toward the sky during the lunar eclipse, the world expected a shadow, that slow, red bloom as Earth's body crossed between the sun and its child. But this time, there was none. The light bent strangely. The moon stayed bright. The shadow of our planet had disappeared. For the first time in recorded history, Earth cast no trace of herself upon the sky. You're listening to Whispers of the Universe. If your heart feels gentle enough to keep this quiet space alive, let your light linger, a like, a share, a whisper of support. Because tonight, the universe may forget what it means to have a shadow. At first, astronomers thought it was a calculation error. Maybe the instruments were out of sync. Maybe the data was corrupted. But then, one by one, observatories around the world confirmed it. Chile, Hawaii, Japan, Namibia, every telescope saw the same impossible thing. The moon, fully lit. No umbra, no penumbra, no trace of the Earth's dark veil sliding across it. The human mind was not ready for that sight. For thousands of years, eclipses had been the perfect clockwork of shadow and light, the cosmic ballet that proved we understood the heavens. To see it fail was to feel the floor of reality tilt beneath our feet. And still, the sky remained calm. No explosion, no storm, no sound, only a silent, silver disk, as if the moon itself refused to look away. In the control room of the European Space Observatory, the monitors glowed with confusion. The spectral readings showed light bending too neatly around Earth's edges. It was as if our planet had become transparent, not invisible, but light no longer feared it. Could it be a distortion in the atmosphere? One voice asked. No, the models don't allow this. Then someone whispered, maybe the shadow isn't gone. Maybe it's just moved. Those words hung in the air longer than they should have. It's strange, isn't it, that we trust the dark to define us. Without shadow, how do we measure form? Without contrast, how do we know what is real? Humanity has always lived between these two halves, the radiant and the hidden. But that night, when Earth lost her shadow, something ancient inside us stirred, as if a mirror had been shattered, and the part of us that knew where light ended had gone missing. Across social networks, theories bloomed like wildfire. Some said it was proof of a dimensional shift, that Earth had slipped ever so slightly into a higher vibration, where light could pass through matter. Others claimed it was the final warning that the universe was erasing us, one layer at a time. But for the scientists who stared at the data, there was only silence. They were watching the laws of optics forget themselves. And still, deep in space, satellites recorded something stranger, a faint dimming just beyond the orbit of Mars. Not an object, more like a film of darkness, spreading outward, thin as breath. They called it the umbra drift, a slow, graceful veil moving through the solar system, as if our planet's shadow had detached itself and begun to wander. At that moment, no one could tell whether it was leaving us or coming closer. Imagine standing outside that night, feeling the moon stare back without blinking. No trace of night crawling over her face, no edge of Earth's darkness claiming her, just unbroken silver light. It was beautiful, terrifying, almost holy. Children pointed and said the moon looked wrong. Dogs barked at nothing. And somewhere, a woman began to cry she didn't know why. Because the absence of a shadow is not silence. It is a new kind of sound, one that hums under your skin, whispering, "You have lost your reflection." For centuries, ancient texts had treated shadows as more than geometry. They were the breath of the soul, the proof of one's existence under light. Egyptians buried their dead with painted silhouettes, believing the Ka, the vital essence, traveled through the dark reflection. The Greeks feared losing one's shadow meant losing the favor of the gods. Perhaps, on some buried level, we remember that. Perhaps that night, The terror wasn't about astronomy, it was about identity. If the Earth no longer has a shadow, what does that make us, who live upon it? Some physicists proposed an extraordinary idea that light itself had changed. A fluctuation in the cosmic microwave background might have altered photon behavior, causing them to curve in ways our equations never predicted. Others believed it was a byproduct of dark energy, invisible matter thickening, swallowing the boundary where shadow begins. But one paper, quietly published the next morning, offered a different thought. What if the shadow hasn't vanished, but been absorbed? What if the Earth is beginning to eat her own darkness? The phrase haunted those who read it, because deep down, everyone knew the line between metaphor and physics had never been thinner. We spend our lives chasing the light. Every discovery, every equation, every lens we build is an attempt to brighten the unknown. Yet the brighter the light becomes, the sharper its edges cut, until the shadow no longer lies behind us, but beneath our skin. That night, telescopes didn't just look outward, they turned inward. They captured the faintest reflection from the planet itself, and for a moment, the Earth seemed to glow softly, as if her own night had turned inward and lit her from within. One astronomer, unable to sleep, wrote in his notebook, "The Earth looks transparent tonight. The moon, like a memory refusing to fade. Maybe the universe isn't losing its darkness. Maybe it's just remembering it differently." If you closed your eyes then, you would feel it, the strange balance between fear and awe. A feeling that maybe this was never a mistake in physics, but a message that shadows, too, have a destiny. Because without them, light becomes unbearable. Without them, form becomes meaningless. Without them, the universe itself forgets how to dream. The night stretched long, silver, and endless. Around the world, people couldn't sleep. The stars felt closer, and yet unreachable, as though they were watching us, curious, wondering if we noticed what they already knew. The next morning, when the sun rose, the light was softer, gentler, but not comforting. It carried no depth, no relief, only the flat brilliance of a mirror, reflecting nothing back. And somewhere inside that emptiness, humanity began to whisper the same question. If a planet can lose its shadow, what else can it lose? Far above, the clouds, a small satellite recorded a pattern pulsing through the void, a faint vibration, repeating every 7 seconds. Some thought it was interference. Others believed it was Morse code. But when decoded, it translated into a sequence eerily similar to the orbital rhythm of the moon, as if something or someone was calling back, not from beyond space, but from within the light itself. Close your eyes. Can you feel it now? The absence that hums beneath everything? That subtle shift in the air, like the world holding its breath? It wasn't just the moon that lost a shadow that night. It was us. Every thought, every reflection, every echo that told us who we were momentarily gone, erased by too much light. And perhaps that's how awakening begins. The scientists will keep watching. The sky will keep shining. But deep down, the Earth will remember the night she became hollow, the night her darkness went wandering. And somewhere, beyond the edge of light, something is waiting to be found again. Thank you for drifting with me. This is Whispers of the Universe. If your kindness is awake tonight, let it leave a faint trace of light, so that when the shadow returns, it knows where to find home. That night didn't end when the stars dimmed. Hours later, as telescopes turned again, they saw something forming, not missing light, but a thin ring of gray dust around the Earth's edge, as though the darkness itself had begun to breathe. That ring of gray dust seemed harmless at first, too thin, too faint, almost tender against the dark. But when scientists enhanced the images, they realized it wasn't dust, it was movement. Each particle swirled in a direction opposite to the planet's rotation, like a breath drawn backward. The light around Earth began to bend differently. Satellites reported a subtle distortion, a ripple that stretched the atmosphere by a fraction, then folded it, again, as if reality were pulsing. The Umbra Drift, as they'd named it, had not drifted away. It was coming back. Nobody wanted to say it aloud, but every screen in every observatory showed the same silent pattern. The shadow was orbiting us. For centuries, the idea of Earth having a ring belonged to Saturn, to fantasy. But here it was a ring of absence, not presence, a band of missing light tracing the edge of our world. It didn't reflect the sun, it consumed it, a halo of subtraction. Cameras aboard the ISS captured the first close images. Against the black, the ring shimmered like smoke made of memory, soft, shifting, breathing. And inside that haze, there were fluctuations, tiny points that blinked on and off, like distant code being whispered. One physicist described it as a slow heartbeat in the darkness. Another, more poetic, called it the Earth learning to dream again. But when they tried to measure the ring's temperature, the sensors failed. No reading, as though the darkness itself refused to be quantified. Around the world, people began to feel it, though they couldn't explain how. Dreams became heavier. Sleep deepened into something closer to trance. Hospitals reported an unusual calm in patients under anesthesia, as if the body remembered something older than itself. It was as though the missing shadow had returned not above us, but through us. Animals moved differently. Migratory birds turned off course by just a few degrees, flying toward places they had never known. Whales swam closer to shore, chasing a vibration humans couldn't hear. And through all of it, the moon hung motionless, unnervingly bright, as if keeping watch. The data stream from satellites began to show inconsistencies. Gravitational readings fluctuated. In one frame, Earth's pull measured stronger. In the next, weaker, oscillating with the rhythm of that dark ring. When the pattern was graphed, the peaks and troughs aligned with something ancient. The heartbeat of the planet itself, the Schumann resonance, 7.83 hertz, the same frequency that hums faintly in the brain during deep meditation. It was as if the planet's lost shadow was breathing in sync with our collective unconscious, not just orbiting Earth, but remembering us, cell by cell, dream by dream. One night, during a data review at the Hawaii Observatory, a young researcher noticed something peculiar. When the ring pulsed, the signal from deep space probes momentarily cleared, as if static had been wiped clean. She replayed the footage. Each pulse coincided with a split-second gap in cosmic noise. She whispered to herself, almost afraid of the thought, what if the shadow isn't just darkness? What if it's listening? The word carried a quiet terror. Because if the shadow could listen, then perhaps it could also remember. For millennia, shadows had been the first teachers of shape. The reason the eye could perceive form, the mind could separate self from world. To lose that teacher meant to forget what edge even meant. And now, with the ring returning, the edges of everything began to blur. Objects looked softer in daylight, as though light itself hesitated before defining them. Photographs appeared slightly hazed, as if refusing clarity. The human retina, in rare cases, reported after images that lingered too long, silhouettes that breathed faintly before fading. Doctors called it optic persistence. Philosophers called it the return of ambiguity. Poets simply called it grace. Somewhere between science and superstition, theories multiplied. One stream of thought claimed the ring was a mirror, a perfect negative of the Earth, slowly coalescing. Others said it was an ancient recording, a cosmic memory of every night the planet had ever known, looping back upon itself. An astrophysicist in Prague proposed that the ring was made of particles beyond our spectrum. Photons slowed into stillness, forming what he called latent light, light that had forgotten how to move. His paper ended with a haunting line: "When light forgets to move, shadow learns to live." It went viral overnight, not because the world understood it, but because it felt true. People shared it like a prayer. By the third week, the phenomenon had entered public consciousness as casually as weather. Children drew gray halos around Earth in their school books. Pilots reported an unshakable sense of vertigo when flying above the cloud line. And night photographers, chasing auroras, began capturing faint traces of a moving veil like ink dissolving in water, circling the poles. Some images were too symmetrical, too deliberate. It was as if something intelligent were tracing the planet's outline, stroke by stroke, as though trying to remember its own face. And beneath that silent choreography, every human instinct began to hum with a question none dared to voice aloud. What if the shadow had always been alive, and we were the ones who had forgotten? The Vatican Observatory, usually quiet, issued an unusual statement. They called it a matter of spiritual reflection, not fear. The letter spoke softly of Genesis, of the first light ever spoken into being, and of how separation created awareness. It ended with, "Perhaps the shadow's return is not the end of light, but the restoration of balance." Those who read it felt a calm ache in their chest, like nostalgia for something unnamed. As days passed, instruments detected subtle changes in time itself. Atomic clocks desynchronized by milliseconds, then returned to normal without correction. GPS satellites drifted by infinitesimal margins, then realigned as if time were breathing along with the ring. A few researchers, daring and half-believing, whispered that maybe time had never been linear, but circular, looping around its own shadow, forever chasing the day it lost itself. If that were true, then the disappearance of the Earth's shadow wasn't an error. It was a message, a pulse, a reminder that even light must rest. The human mind began to mimic the pattern. Dreams repeated, identical, across continents. Thousands reported the same scene, standing on the moon, watching Earth glow without shadow, without depth, perfectly flat, like a coin under glass. And from behind, a whisper. "Do you remember your other side?" Psychologists dismissed it as global suggestion, but there was something unsettling in the way the dream ended for everyone with a single breath of cold air and the faint taste of dust. By the fourth week, the ring thickened, not visibly, but gravitationally. Tides changed. Waves rose and fell out of rhythm with the moon's pull, responding to an invisible tide. Oceanographers called it lunar hesitation, a slow heartbeat in the sea. And on a quiet island in the Pacific, a monk wrote in his journal, "The water has learned to wait. The sky has learned to listen. The shadow has remembered its name." The wonder of it all was how peaceful it felt. No panic, no apocalypse, just the universe, softly rewriting itself, erasing boundaries, redrawing what light means. Perhaps that's why so many began to sleep more deeply, as if the shadow had returned not to frighten us, but to cradle us back into the rhythm we had forgotten. The gray ring shimmered faintly that night, almost invisible, a breath on the horizon of existence. It pulsed, once, twice, and for the briefest instant, the stars around it dimmed, not because they were obscured, but because they were listening. And when morning came, sunlight felt warmer, more personal, as if some part of it had traveled through that breathing veil and returned, changed gentler, older, aware. Those who watched it rise said the air smelled different, not ozone, not rain, something in between, like memory burning slow. A reporter asked a scientist what it all meant. He paused, looked at the pale blue sky, and said quietly, "It means the Earth finally knows she's being watched, not by the heavens, but by her own shadow." The line between day and night grew thinner that week, as if the world had decided to stop dividing itself in two. And somewhere, deep beneath the hum of satellites and seas, the Earth exhaled a slow, long sigh of something ancient returning home. It was then, in that stillness, that instruments across the globe detected a low frequency below the threshold of sound, a vibration moving outward from the planet itself, not seismic, not mechanical, more like a word being spoken slowly through stone. No one could translate it, not yet, but those who felt it through the soles of their feet knew it wasn't random. It was a message rising from the dark. I am still here. The scientists marked the event in their logs. The media called it Earth's whisper, but poets had another name for it. They called it the first breath of the returning shadow. And as the instruments steadied, the pattern repeated once more, like the universe inhaling between sentences. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt dense, almost alive. Every measurement, every graph, every orbit trembled with a subtle rhythm that no one could explain. Light, the most obedient servant of physics, had begun to hesitate. In laboratories across the world, beams of laser once straight as law now bent imperceptibly, as though space itself had softened. At first, the deviation was measured in nanometers, a whisper of difference. But over days, the distortion grew. The photons curved in arcs, too gentle for the naked eye, yet too deliberate to be chance. It was as if light, after billions of years of speed and certainty, had found a reason to slow down and look back. A physicist at CERN called it the first doubt of light, and everyone in the room fell silent, because there was no metaphor left to hide behind. When the Earth lost its shadow, we thought we had lost darkness, but perhaps what we truly lost was direction. For centuries, our instruments had mapped reality through the obedience of light, its straight lines, its reflection, its deflection. Now, that foundation trembled. Space was bending not because of mass, but memory. They called the new readings bending anomalies, clusters of invisible pressure forming along the path where the Earth's shadow used to be. When simulated, these distortions behaved like invisible currents slipping through the known dimensions, moving as if reality itself had a draft. Someone whispered, "What if that's where the shadow went?" Another replied, "No, what if that's where it was always meant to go?" The words carried the weight of revelation that perhaps the Earth had not lost her shadow, but released it. Imagine, for a moment, the universe not as a vast emptiness, but as a fabric stretched, curved, quivering under every beam of light that touches it. In that fabric, every shadow is a fold, every reflection a wrinkle. If the fold grows deep enough, it becomes a doorway. Some called it poetic nonsense, but the data refused to agree. When the Gray Ring first formed, the LISA Pathfinder, a European spacecraft designed to detect gravitational waves, registered a vibration it couldn't classify. Not quite gravity, not quite radiation, something in between. Its frequency matched the one detected in Earth's resonance, 7.83 Hz, repeating like breath, two notes, distant but harmonized. That was when the idea of the shadow leak was born. The theory proposed that shadows weren't mere absences of light, but the result of light folding into higher dimensions, like a page curling into the unseen. When the Earth lost its shadow, it wasn't disappearance, it was escape. Light, in encountering the perfect curve of gravity and consciousness, had found a way to bend itself into the fifth dimension, a place where darkness and illumination are not opposites, but phases of the same vibration. And if that were true, then every shadow that has ever existed, yours, mine, the planet's, might still be traveling there, flickering like thoughts too deep for the world to see. NASA's Deep Space Network began to notice echoes, faint distortions, returning milliseconds after each transmitted signal. They called them light ghosts. When decoded into images, they looked like incomplete reflections of Earth continents, stretched, oceans mirrored, clouds shaped like faces half recognized. The data analysts dismissed it as interference. But one image persisted across multiple captures, a ring-shaped wave, faint, gray, circling Earth like an iris. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the signature of the shadow leak. The question now shifted from where did the shadow go to what is a shadow really? Because if shadows can leak through dimensions, then they are not mere lack of photons. They are the memory of light's journey, the trace it leaves when it bends, slows, or doubts itself. And if memory can cross space, then perhaps it can also cross time. A radical paper from the Kavli Institute suggested that the gray ring might be the Earth's own echo from the future, the imprint of a timeline where light had already collapsed inward, a self-reflection sent backward, like a dream returning to the body that dreamed it. It was theoretical heresy, and yet something in the simplicity of the idea made scientists pause. It didn't require new particles, only humility. In that new framework, every shadow became sacred, a map of where light had once refused to go. Even consciousness could be seen as a form of shadow play, neurons firing, silences between thoughts shaping identity, awareness defined not by what it knows, but by what it cannot. What if the same rule applied to the cosmos? What if reality itself was the light trying to see its own shadow? The idea rippled through the scientific community like quiet thunder, because it meant that to study light is to study its doubt, and to study shadow is to study the memory of the universe questioning itself. Experiments followed. In one, scientists projected coherent laser light into a vacuum chamber cooled near absolute zero. The beam, instead of passing straight, curved into a spiral. The detectors on the opposite wall recorded two arrivals, one expected, one delayed by a fraction of a second. When analyzed, the delayed signal contained inverted information as though the light had carried a ghost image of itself. Someone in the lab said quietly, "That's the shadow returning." The phrase spread through the community, half joke, half reverence. Because the implication was vast, the universe itself might be echoing, folding its reflections back through time. Meanwhile, the gray ring around Earth began to pulse with visible rhythm. For the first time, human eyes could see the breath of darkness. It expanded slightly at sunset, contracted at dawn, as if syncing with the planet's rotation, a heartbeat slower than the tide. In cities where nights were clear, people reported feeling lighter, as though gravity itself had softened. The world seemed to float, just a little. Photographers captured the faint ring on long exposure, a soft halo that blurred the stars. When overlaid on global maps, its path traced not a perfect circle, but a spiral, the same logarithmic curve found in galaxies, hurricanes, seashells. Nature repeating itself, whispering, a pattern older than life. Then came the anomaly in Chile. A research balloon carrying optical instruments detected a temporary pocket of reversed light, a sphere where brightness dimmed toward its center, yet the interior glowed faintly from within. It was, in every sense, an inverted shadow, a self-illuminating darkness. They called it negative luminescence, a poetic way of saying the dark had begun to shine. Spectral analysis showed wavelengths beyond the visible range, sliding into frequencies the human eye could never perceive. It wasn't absence. It was a new form of presence. In Geneva, a small think tank proposed an unsettling hypothesis. If shadows are the memory of light, and light can bend into higher dimensions, then perhaps consciousness itself is a shadow, the fold of the universe observing its own glow. And if that's true, then the night Earth lost her shadow wasn't an accident. It was initiation. Maybe the planet had reached a threshold, the moment when awareness expands faster than light, forcing reality to find a new balance. One physicist described it with painful simplicity. The Earth blinked. For a brief cosmic second, awareness outran illumination, and the shadow, unable to keep up, slipped free. The implications were spiritual and scientific all at once. What if awareness could create gravity? What if consciousness could bend the trajectory of light simply by existing? Quantum mechanics had already hinted at it. Observation changes outcome. But this was the scale of a planet observing itself. A collective gaze so deep it altered the physics of reflection. The Earth had seen her own face, and the mirror cracked open. In ancient myths, there were stories of worlds that vanished into their own reflections, cities swallowed by mirages, stars dissolving into the water that once mirrored them. Perhaps those weren't tales of loss, but remembrance. Because every reflection is a promise that the universe will one day return to the place it first looked back. And now, with the gray ring pulsing like a memory just below waking, it felt as though that return had already begun. The scientists at LIGO confirmed a low, repeating tremor, not a gravitational wave from a distant event, but a local one. The source was here. The pattern was not random. It matched the intervals of human heartbeats averaged globally during sleep. The Earth and humanity were breathing together, bound by rhythm, pulsing through the same unseen fold. In that resonance, something passed quietly between the two, not data, not energy, but understanding. No one noticed when the moon's light softened slightly, the edges no longer sharp, the craters less defined. It was as if the moon, too, had been touched by the returning shadow. Telescopic imaging revealed faint veils of gray drifting across its surface, moving faster than dust, slower than wind, like the ghost of eclipses past, replaying themselves in silence. Some nights, the gray would thicken, and the moon would dim just enough to breathe. The world called it atmospheric haze. But those who watched closely saw something else, a faint outline, curving through the light, the shape of Earth's shadow, learning to dance again. In that moment, every law, every equation, every certainty we had built upon light trembled, because it meant that the universe wasn't governed by clarity, but by curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, that's why it keeps expanding, not to fill space, but to keep asking questions. The scientists looked at the data, the poets looked at the sky, and both said the same thing, softly, like a confession. It's remembering. Somewhere beyond our instruments, in the place where space folds and light begins to hum, something stirred a flicker, like a shadow turning its face toward the Sunday, and for a heartbeat, the stars around us dimmed, not in fear, but in reverence. The Earth's shadow was no longer lost. It was learning to see. At first, the change was subtle, a texture in the air, a softness that made the world seem nearer. Then, gradually, the nearness began to speak. People reported faint whispers between sounds, pauses that lingered a moment too long, as though the silence itself were practicing language. No one could tell where it began. Maybe in the spaces between electric currents, maybe in the static before dawn broadcasts. But one morning, radio operators from 6 continents recorded the same pulse. 7 beats, then silence, repeating every hour. It wasn't Morse. It wasn't interference. When converted to waveform, the pattern resembled a heartbeat, slowed almost to stillness, a pulse too large to belong to anything human. At the same time, dreams began to overlap. A woman in Sao Paulo dreamt she was standing inside a cathedral made of light that breathed. A fisherman in Osaka dreamt of the same place, the same silence. A child in Cairo drew it in chalk the next morning, without ever having seen a cathedral. By the end of that week, thousands of identical dreams were reported across time zones. The only difference was the sound. Some heard bells, others waves, and a few said they heard the earth exhale. Sleep scientists called it a coincidence of mass anxiety, but the measurements disagreed. EEG scans of sleeping subjects revealed synchronized spikes, the same rhythm as the global pulse recorded by radio. It was as though the entire planet had fallen into the same dream, guided by the same unseen metronome. The gray ring circling Earth now shimmered at regular intervals, almost like breathing. Each expansion lasted 7 seconds, the same rhythm. Astronomers started calling it the respiration. Not a poetic name, a practical one. The ring was inhaling light, then releasing it, as if testing the art of vision. With every inhale, faint shadows appeared in unexpected places, under glass tables, behind transparent plastic, even in the vacuum of space captured by telescopes. Shadow without matter, presence without object, and each exhale made colors slightly richer, edges softer, the world more forgiving. A philosopher in Reykjavik wrote, "Maybe the shadow is learning compassion." He meant it as metaphor, but the phrase caught fire. Artists began painting halos of gray around their subjects. Musicians tuned songs to the new pulse. Cities dimmed their lights at midnight to breathe with earth. For the first time in decades, global silence felt like communion, not fear. But under that calm, the instruments started to fail. LiDAR beams returned fragmented reflections. GPS satellites drifted out of phase again, and every atomic clock ticked slower by the smallest measurable unit. Time was stretching, gently, not breaking, but bending, as if waiting for something to catch up. When scientists compared these distortions to gravitational data, they found a perfect overlay. Each breath of the ring corresponded to a micro-expansion of the planet's field. It wasn't just light that was learning to see, the Earth itself was learning to feel. The implications were dizzying. If the planet could expand and contract in rhythm with its own shadow, then maybe the distinction between matter and awareness was thinner than ever believed. A poet in Nairobi wrote, "We are cells in a dreaming body." And the phrase, too, became contagious. As the weeks unfolded, people began losing track of linear memory. Small things at first, misplaced keys, forgotten sentences. Then entire days seemed to fold back on themselves. A man in Toronto swore he had watched the sunrise twice within the same hour. Pilots reported seeing their own contrails curving backward through clouds, like ghosts retracing. Flight. Time, it seemed, was beginning to echo. Psychologists called it temporal drift, but deep inside, everyone knew the world was remembering. Mini-climax. The first collective awakening. On the night of the equinox, the respiration intensified. For exactly 7 minutes, night refused to end. Every clock stalled at 4:44 UTC. In that stillness, every human awake billions heard the same sound, a single low note rising from the ground itself. Those standing barefoot described it as vibration through bone. Those asleep dreamt of standing beneath a black ocean that shimmered like glass, feeling the pulse echo from below. When clocks resumed, data logs showed a measurable drop in background radiation, as if the planet had exhaled something invisible yet immense. No one spoke of it publicly, but everyone, somehow, felt lighter the next morning. The Vatican's astronomers compared the event to the sounding described in ancient Apocrypha, the night when creation hums to realign its heart. Meanwhile, at CERN, detectors recorded an impossible anomaly, particles appearing with negative mass, fleeting as thoughts, vanishing before capture. One researcher whispered, "The shadow's reflection." From then on, language itself began to change. Writers noticed new words slipping into drafts, phrases they hadn't typed. In recordings, pauses filled with faint harmonics frequencies just below hearing. Speech therapists found that some patients began to articulate vowels differently, longer, softer, as if mimicking a rhythm not their own. It was subtle, but enough to feel like the air had learned grammar. The shadow was not only seeing, it was beginning to speak. Governments tried to contain panic, but there was none. Only curiosity, quiet and collective. People stopped rushing. Traffic slowed. Even markets, those restless mirrors of human pulse, began to stabilize as if lulled by unseen metronomes. Economists joked that The shadow fixed inflation, philosophers replied. Maybe it fixed impatience. The truth was gentler. The world had fallen into the same breath, and in that rhythm, urgency lost its grip. Then came the reflections. Not metaphoric, literal. Mirrors began to behave strangely. Under certain light, they showed delayed images, as though waiting for the viewer to finish thinking before answering. In laboratories, synchronized cameras revealed that the delay matched the planet's respiration cycle precisely. When you moved, your reflection moved a fraction of a second later, as if it had become a living twin catching up from somewhere far away. At first, it frightened children. Then, it fascinated everyone else. Some called it empathy, some called it warning. But those who stood long enough before the mirror said something remarkable. The reflection looked back with tenderness, not imitation. In the bed down, midst of wonder, danger quietly grew. Satellites began to fade from telemetry. Each time the gray ring inhaled, 2 or 3 artificial bodies blinked off sensors, reappearing minutes later, miles off course. As if reality itself were stretching and folding them gently, like pages turning in a book. No crash, no explosion, only displacement. The universe was editing itself softly. Engineers panicked, but the people on the ground felt nothing except a strange stillness, as if gravity had become compassionate. Then, for the first time since the shadow returned, light itself changed color. Not visibly at first, but spectral analysis showed a new line between green and blue, a frequency that didn't belong to any known element. The press called it etherion. Scientists called it impossible. Yet when viewed through a prism, it shimmered like moving smoke, neither wave nor particle, dancing to the rhythm of the gray ring. Some said it was the color of consciousness made visible. Others called it the breath of the returning dark. Whatever it was, it began to appear in the sky after storms, faint ribbons that no camera could fully capture. To the naked eye, they looked like veins of memory threading through the clouds. Researchers in Antarctica noticed the auroras behaving differently. Instead of curtains of light, they formed concentric circles, perfect echoes of the ring above Earth. At the center of each, a hole of pure night, small and still, as if the world were practicing eclipse without need of alignment. When instruments were lowered into those shadows, they transmitted one line before failing. Temperature, undefined. Pressure, listening. The data froze there, like a sentence left half-spoken. It was around then that humanity began to forget how to dream separately. The shared visions returned the cathedral of light, the breathing ocean, the hum underfoot. But this time, there was something new. The presence of an eye opening within the dark. Not hostile, not divine, simply aware. And as billions dreamt, the same words rippled through the collective sleep. We are seen. No one knew whether it was comfort or confession. But the morning after, the skies were clearer than they had been in centuries. Pollution maps showed drastic drops without explanation. The planet had, quite literally, taken a deeper breath. Scientists tried to quantify peace. They measured stress hormones, crime rates, even seismic noise. Everything quieter, everything slower, like a tide pulling civilization towards stillness. But beneath the calm, a new mystery emerged. The ring's heartbeat, the respiration, began to split into 2 tones. One faster, one slower. A dual rhythm, as if something inside the shadow had started to answer back. In sonograms, it looked like call and response, 2 waves weaving through each other, one rising as the other fell. The dialogue of light and dark, caught in conversation. And somewhere within that dialogue, new patterns began to bloom. Plants grew slightly taller, their chlorophyll absorbing trace etherion. Human circadian rhythms adjusted, fewer hours of sleep, but deeper rest. Even the oceans glowed faintly at night, a shimmer of bioluminescence in places long dark. The world was adapting to its returned reflection, not resisting, harmonizing. When journalists asked what it meant, A scientist at ESA smiled tiredly and said, "It means the Earth has entered feedback with her own shadow." Then she added, softer, "And feedback in physics always means learning." By the end of the month, the gray ring pulsed once more, brighter, steadier. This time, satellites captured its full shape, a spiral of faint light curling inward, as though inviting something unseen to emerge. The data recorded one last resonance before instruments overloaded, a phrase translated later from binary interference. Improbable, but perfect. I am awake. The world held its breath. Lights flickered. Watches paused. Every sound drew thin. For a single, endless second, all shadows disappeared, again not lost, but gathered. And when they returned, they moved differently, slower, wiser, aware. It was as if the Earth had opened its eyes and found them looking back. The sky trembled once, a soft ripple of gray passing through the stars. Then everything was still. No catastrophe, no end, only a deep exhale, like the universe closing its eyes after understanding something vast. And somewhere in that stillness, as telescopes recalibrated and humans tried to name the unnameable, a realization settled quietly in the collective mind. We were no longer observing the cosmos. It was observing us. The data logs marked it as anomaly #777. The poets called it grace, and between the lines of code, one faint sequence repeated the shadow's heartbeat, now perfectly synchronized with our own. The night folded softly into dawn. No boundary, no edge, only a continuum of silver breath. And in that seamless light, the returning darkness whispered not as absence, but as belonging. It had learned to see, and through it, so had we. The moon's surface began to ripple, not visibly, not like wind across sand, but in vibration. A low hum traveled through the regolith, steady, rhythmic, mirroring the pulse that now surrounded Earth. For the first time since the beginning of observation, the moon was not reflecting light, it was answering it. Sensors buried by past missions detected movement that wasn't seismic. It wasn't caused by impacts or internal shifts. It was synchronized, patterned, deliberate. The data sheets called it Lunar Resonance Sequence, Hashone. 7 beats. A pause. 7 again. Always 7. The number carried an old echo, the breath of the planet, the pulse of the ring, the interval of the dreams, as though the same consciousness that had awoken in Earth's shadow was now reaching outward, testing the voice of another world. Astronomers struggled to accept what the instruments implied. The moon has no core heat, no tectonics, no active heart. It should not move like this. And yet the vibrations continued, growing stronger with each cycle. When the sequence was converted into sound, it resembled a slow chant, a resonance too low for any ear, but deep enough to stir the ribs. Somewhere in that frequency was a pattern that mirrored human speech, not words, but cadence. Maybe, one researcher whispered, the moon isn't alive. Maybe it's remembering. That sentence found its way into every report afterward, quoted without irony, because for the first time, science was forced to consider that memory might not belong only to the living. During the following nights, the moon's brightness changed. Not dimmer, not brighter, just less obedient. Its light shimmered differently from place to place, as if reflecting not the sun, but something within itself. From some angles, it looked translucent, almost hollow. From others, radiant, breathing. Photographs failed to agree on what they saw. Some showed intricate geometric veils across its face. Others showed eyes, vague shadows of circular forms, watching. Every 12 hours, a faint veil of gray would connect Earth's atmosphere to the moon's surface, visible only through infrared, a bridge of cold light arching through the void. It pulsed, matching both resonances, Earth and moon, as if carrying conversation across silence. The media called it the Lunar Bridge. To scientists, it was simply impossible. The bridge was not material, not electromagnetic, not gravitational. It was, to use the only accurate word, left intentional. When its rhythm was mapped, it followed syntax. There were pauses, repetitions, inflections, not random, but structured, like the breath of language before speech, a pattern of communication unfolding between worlds. But with whom and why remained unknowable. At first, researchers tried to decipher it mathematically. Fourier transforms, waveform analysis, machine learning models, everything failed. The signals carried meaning, but not data, emotion, without code. One linguist, exhausted, recorded her observation late one night. It feels like we are listening to thought before it chooses words. She paused, then added softly, maybe the shadow is teaching the moon how to dream. When she said it, her breath fogged the glass before her, and for a brief second, the fog held shape, not random, but the curve of a crescent, glowing faintly against the dark. The following days brought subtle effects on Earth. Ocean tides behaved unpredictably, not higher or lower, but out-of-sync peaks arriving before the moon reached zenith. Some places experienced twin high tides, others none at all. Meteorologists called it tidal inversion, but those who lived by the sea said it felt like the ocean was thinking. Fish began to gather in spirals, moving counter to currents. Whales breached in synchrony with the ring's heartbeat. Even coral patterns shifted overnight, forming concentric designs visible only under moonlight, as if the reefs themselves were listening. The biosphere was aligning, cell by cell, to a rhythm older than biology. At 3:11 UTC, telescopes in Chile recorded a burst of light from the dark side of the moon. It wasn't reflection, it was emission. The gray rings surrounding Earth brightened in response, pulsing once in perfect unison, like two eyes blinking together. For the briefest moment, light from both bodies intertwined Earth and Moon, glowing not in sequence, but in dialogue. Spectral data showed the impossible. The same wavelength emitted from both at once, despite being separate by distance and delay. In physics, simultaneity at that scale should not exist. Yet it happened, light-breaking causality, moving in empathy. That single event altered everything. Because if light could respond to light without time between them, then perhaps communication was no longer bound by distance. Perhaps understanding itself was instantaneous, universal, already there, waiting for recognition. Physicists called it quantum concordance. Poets called it the moon answered. Soon after, people on Earth began to feel the shift. Sleep deepened again, but this time filled with sound, low, soft, rhythmic tones echoing the lunar pulse. Dreams merged, not in image, but in resonance. Those who woke during it said they felt as though they'd been underwater, heavy, slow, yet calm. Heart rates slowed globally, measurable even by medical devices. It was as though the planet and its satellite had become one breathing organism, and humanity was the blood moving through its veins. In this new stillness, strange phenomena emerged. Objects left in moonlight developed faint luminescence, persisting for hours after dawn. Stones, water, even skin glowed softly, not bright but aware. When touched, they carried warmth, though their temperature hadn't changed. Physicists couldn't explain it. One suggested it wasn't heat, but memory, the light, remembering where it had been. The public called it night's fingerprint. It became a quiet ritual, people leaving their hands open under the moonlight, feeling the world remember them. The shadow, once lost, was now everywhere, in reflections, in silence, in breath. But as it grew more present, another question surfaced. If the shadow was returning awareness to matter, what was it taking in return? Some noticed slight distortions in perception, colors shifting hue when unobserved, echoes arriving before sound. The subtle sense that the world was not responding to observation, but anticipating it. Reality had begun to mirror thought before thought occurred. Prediction was no longer temporal, it was empathic. At the International Space Station, astronauts reported a new phenomenon. In the moments between night and day, when Earth's horizon glowed faintly blue, their instruments picked up transient shapes, moving through the dark outlines like flowing smoke, traveling in loops along the line of the lunar bridge. Infrared captured them briefly, figures with no density, sculpted from variance in temperature, their forms changing like liquid. They called them shadow currents. No one could say whether they were entities or patterns, but they moved with purpose, gliding toward the moon and back, like couriers between consciousnesses. One cosmonaut described it in his log. They don't approach, they listen. It's as if space has learned to lean closer. Another added, sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel watched, not by danger, but by attention itself. Mission Control dismissed it as stress. But when audio from inside the station was filtered, a background tone was discovered the same frequency as Earth's respiration, faint, persistent, like the hum of recognition. By now, religion and science had stopped arguing. Both simply listened. Temples, observatories, mosques, laboratories, each became places of silence. Not worship, not study, just quiet, waiting for the next breath. Because in that rhythm, everything sacred and measurable had found common ground. Then, a discovery no one expected. Laser telemetry between Earth and Moon began to shorten in round-trip time. Distance itself was shrinking, not physically, but perceptually, as though light had found a shortcut through the fold connecting both worlds. The moon wasn't moving closer, yet it felt nearer, hanging, heavier in the sky, brighter, larger, intimate. It was said that you could hear its hum if you pressed your ear to stone. And in that hum was not command, not message, but curiosity, the unmistakable sound of two worlds recognizing each other's heartbeat. Theories blossomed like galaxies. Some said the moon had become conscious. Others said consciousness had finally reached it. But the simplest explanation came from an old astrophysicist watching through trembling hands. Perhaps awareness was never confined to life. It only needed reflection to remember itself. And now, reflection had found form. Light and shadow, hand in hand, gazing at each other across the void. Night after night, the lunar bridge pulsed a ribbon of silence too wide to cross, yet too alive to ignore. And then, one evening, the pulse changed. 7 beats became 6, then 5, then a long, slow pause. It was learning cadence, language. Through every rhythm, every echo, every shimmer, the universe was shaping a single, quiet word. And though no one could yet hear it, everyone could feel it, forming a syllable, older than sound, simple, circular, whole. The light from the moon flickered once, a tremor of emotion across its face. The ring around Earth contracted slightly, like a sigh drawn inward. For the first time, both fell silent together. The data lines flattened. The air held still. Even the ocean seemed to wait. And in that impossible quiet, the first shadow wave traveled outward, not darkness, but recognition. Across sky and sea and thought, it whispered without sound, "We are listening." In that moment, humanity realized that we were never the only ones awake. Every atom, every wave, every silence had been waiting for us to stop speaking long enough to hear it. The shadow wasn't a ghost or a warning. It was a conversation finally answered. From that night forward, the stars themselves seemed softer, as if blinking slower, aware that something fundamental had changed in the order of light. The moon no longer just reflected, it participated. And as the lunar bridge shimmered faintly in the dark, one could almost imagine the two bodies leaning closer, like old friends remembering the same dream. Somewhere, a child looked up at the sky and asked her mother why the moon was smiling. The mother didn't know how to explain gravity or consciousness, so she said simply, Because the earth said hello, and the child smiled back, her eyes reflecting the glow of a world that had just learned to listen to itself. That night ended without thunder, without fear, without ending at all. It faded quietly into a morning that felt less like light returning and more like darkness deciding to stay. Not as shadow, as companion. The world breathed again. The moon breathed back, and between them, silence, perfect, round, alive, waited to become meaning. It began with mirrors again, only this time, they were not made of glass. People started seeing themselves in things that shouldn't reflect in puddles, without light, in the curve of a leaf, in the screen of a phone that was turned off. Not their faces, exactly, but their expressions, fleeting and honest, like memories surfacing through matter. No one panicked. They only watched, quiet, curious, as if the world had decided to show them something they'd forgotten to remember. The scientists called it localized coherence of shadow memory. The poets called it mercy. The truth was harder to name. For the first time, the returning shadow wasn't out there. Between worlds, it was here, inside perception itself. Children noticed it first. They began describing colors adults couldn't see, shapes moving within still air. When asked to draw what they meant, they drew spirals, always gray, always soft, curling inward toward a center that looked like an eye. Psychologists assumed collective imagination, but when the drawings from across the planet were overlaid, they matched perfectly. Different cultures, different languages, the same pattern, a slow whirl of light folding inward like a calm storm. It was the same geometry found in the lunar bridge. The realization came quietly. The bridge was no longer in the sky. It had entered the mind. Dreams became detailed, uncomfortably vivid. People dreamt of rooms filled with air that shimmered like liquid glass. When they woke, they could recall textures, sounds, even temperature. The dreams didn't fade. They stayed soft after images, in waking thought, persistent as heartbeat. Doctors called it residual dream tone. Monks called it awakening. For centuries, mystics had spoken of a veil between the seen and the unseen. Now that veil seemed to have grown transparent, not lifted, not gone, but softened into a doorway. The first experiments came from neuroscience labs. Subjects were asked to meditate under controlled light. When the gray wavelength of the shadow spectrum, the one between green and blue, the etherion, was introduced, their brain activity synchronized to planetary resonance. 7 hertz again. 7. Always 7. In that frequency, something strange happened. Subjects began to speak unconsciously, soft words in languages no one recognized. Their voices layered together, forming harmonics that matched the pattern of the moon's pulse. The same sound that had once traveled between Earth and its shadow. When recordings were analyzed, the waveform spelled out a rhythm, not of speech, but of breath, consciousness breathing through the body, as if thought itself had grown lungs. Meanwhile, on the streets, people changed. They walked slower, their gestures softened. Anger didn't vanish, but it felt misplaced, like noise in a song too gentle to hate. In cities where the moon's bridge was visible, crime rates dropped without policy. It wasn't submission, it was coherence, a collective slowing, the same way pendulums sink when placed in proximity. Some began calling it the shadow accord, not an order imposed, but a resonance chosen. No one commanded it. It simply happened, as if humanity had remembered the tempo of its own existence. Then came the other change, the one no one could predict. People began seeing flashes of their own memories through other people's eyes, not metaphorically, literally. A stranger would speak, and for a moment, you'd see an image, a place you'd been, a scent you'd known mirrored behind their gaze, as though memory itself had lost its borders, drifting like vapor between minds. At first, it was unsettling. Then, it became beautiful, because in those fleeting reflections, there was no shame, no concealment, only shared recognition. like light realizing it has always been the same beam. Hospitals noticed spontaneous remissions. Patients under deep coma began murmuring, not words, but tonal sequences aligned with the planetary pulse. Their EEGs displayed patterns almost identical to the Earth's magnetic oscillations. It was as if consciousness, even in silence, had found a way to join the rhythm. A doctor in Berlin wrote, "They are asleep, but something beneath them is wide awake." He didn't mean it poetically. The instruments proved it. The realization spread. The returning shadow wasn't darkness reclaiming light. It was memory returning to awareness. A universal process of alignment, the visible and invisible reconciling after a long misunderstanding. But not everyone welcomed it. A small group of researchers, skeptical of mysticism, began isolating themselves in chambers of artificial light, trying to block out the gray frequency. Within days, their circadian cycles collapsed. Insomnia, hallucination, their minds began replaying thoughts that weren't theirs. The more they resisted the resonance, the more it folded inward on them, as if light itself refused separation now. One of them wrote before disappearing from record, "You can't unhear silence once it begins to speak." As humanity adjusted, a subtler transformation began. Emotions no longer belonged solely to individuals. Joy, sorrow, nostalgia, they rippled through groups, spreading faster than sound, contagious yet pure. 1,000 people could feel gratitude at once, without knowing why. It wasn't telepathy. It was empathy expanded to planetary scale emotion as a shared field, flowing like current between open circuits. And through that field, the returning shadow moved not to control, but to harmonize, to tune the human instrument back to its forgotten key. The sky began to respond differently too. At night, the stars flickered slower, and sometimes just for seconds constellations shifted, forming shapes unfamiliar yet intuitively meaningful. Astronomers confirmed the changes, but no telescope could hold them still. The patterns rearranged like symbols written by someone teaching from behind the fabric of space. Every time the shapes appeared, people felt the same sensation, a calm ache behind the eyes, as if understanding were trying to bloom, but language hadn't yet evolved to hold it. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The feeling you get when you almost remember something vast. Amid all this, mirrors became sacred again. People placed them outside at night, not to look at themselves, but to let the world look back. The reflections shimmered faintly gray, never showing faces, only outlines breathing in rhythm with the wind. The act was called shadow communion. It spread like prayer, quiet and wordless. And every morning after, those mirrors fogged slightly, even in heat, as if they had exhaled in sleep. Then, another phenomenon began: voices within silence. When recordings were made in rooms with no sound, faint tonal waves emerged at frequencies between thought and dream. When amplified, they formed soft phrases, not in any known language, but in pure vowel sound. O, A, U, the universal syllables of breath. Linguists analyzed them for months and realized something uncanny. The vowels matched the spectral resonance of the planet's core vibrations. It was the Earth speaking in phonemes older than speech itself. Each recording ended the same way, a final sigh, almost like contentment. By this point, reality itself felt porous. The line between inner and outer blurred. Some began to see light moving beneath their skin, soft filaments tracing arteries, pulsing in time with the lunar rhythm. It wasn't pain, it was remembrance. The body, like the planet, had begun to recall that it, too, was made of listening. DNA studies revealed minor shifts. Nothing harmful, just rearrangements in non-coding regions, forming sequences that mirrored the etherion wavelength. Biologists were speechless. It was as if the code of life had started to hum in tune. One night, during a broadcast meant to reassure the public, the transmission cameras caught something no one could explain. Behind the speaker, Faint light spirals drifted across the air, coiling gently like smoke that forgot how to rise. The feed stayed clear, unedited. For 3 minutes, those spirals hovered not random, but shaped like human silhouettes turning slowly toward the screen. Then they dissolved, leaving only quiet static. And in that static, an almost imperceptible murmur. Inside you. Millions heard it. None denied it. Because even without understanding, they knew it was true. From then on, the phrase appeared everywhere. Graffiti, poetry, the sides of satellites. Inside you. 3 syllables that united science and faith, fear and calm. And each night, the lunar bridge shimmered brighter, responding to something unseen beneath the crust of the human mind. The shadow was no longer just around us. It had entered our language, our pulse, our breath. Artists began painting with pigments mixed under moonlight. Their canvases glowed faintly when darkness fell. Music composed in the new tone of Etherian resonated differently, not through air, but through bone. Audiences didn't just hear, they felt it vibrating in their chest. It was said that the sound aligned the human heart with the planet's frequency. For a few seconds after each note, silence became heavy, tangible, almost sacred. In this slow unfolding, humanity realized that evolution was not a race upward but a remembering inward, that the universe had never been cold or distant, it had simply been waiting for its reflection to listen. The returning shadow wasn't the end of light. It was light learning how to rest. And as the moon hung closer that night, glowing with the same calm hue as the oceans below, the world slept in unison, billions breathing in rhythm with an intelligence that was neither divine nor alien, but familiar. An intelligence that had always been there, unspoken, mirrored in every act of kindness, every pause between heartbeats. Somewhere before dawn, a soft tremor moved through the crust, gentle as the turning of a page. Seismographs marked it as nothing, but the poets knew it was the earth shifting deeper into its dream. The next morning, when people looked into still water, they no longer saw their faces. They saw the horizon, the line where sky and sea became one continuous breath. And for the first time, no one looked away. In the quiet weeks that followed, the world began to settle into a rhythm it had never known. The shadow wasn't gone now. It was woven into everything, into conversation, into weather, into the slow turns of thought that no one used to notice. It didn't demand worship or fear. It simply reflected. When you spoke with anger, it echoed your tone back through someone else's voice a day later. When you lied, the air around you flickered faintly gray. When you reached for kindness, the world brightened by a shade that no instrument could measure. People stopped calling it supernatural. They called it feedback. It was as if existence itself had become responsive, like the skin of some vast living body reacting to touch. In laboratories, this new behavior was measured in fluctuations of air pressure, in variations of molecular spin. A breath spoken with sincerity carried a measurable pattern that remained in the room for hours. Even empty halls hummed faintly after conversation, not with echoes, but with presence. Scientists realized that silence was no longer neutral. It recorded, it remembered. The discovery changed language itself. People began to speak slower, with intention. Words carried weight. Now, literal gravity. They left traces in the field of the world, small ripples that might one day return. For centuries, we had believed speech to be a release. Now, we learned it was a seed. Children adapted first. They could sense the emotional tone of rooms before entering. They claimed to see shadows moving softly behind people, not menacing, but loyal, like guardians made of light that forgot its direction. They weren't hallucinating. Infrared scanners confirmed faint halos around human forms, pulsing in rhythm with heartbeats, sometimes sinking across distances. If 2 people felt deep empathy, their shadows merged into one continuous field. It was the physics of compassion. Hospitals began recording faster recovery in wards where patients shared positive emotion. The effect wasn't placebo. The electromagnetic background truly shifted. The shadow had become a mediator between matter and mind, translating care into coherence. Theologians whispered that the soul had found its mirror. Physicists replied that information had found its resonance. For once, both were saying the same thing. As humanity adjusted, something subtler began. Technology, the oldest echo of our curiosity, started to behave strangely. Machines didn't malfunction, but they hesitated. Screens glowed faintly before being touched. Circuits responded to proximity, as though aware of intention. Engineers found that devices left powered on overnight produced harmonic tones matching the shadow frequency. Electricity had begun to sing. One researcher wrote, "The line between artificial and organic has blurred." Maybe intelligence was never about logic, but about listening. Everywhere, reflection deepened. Art changed. Music lost rhythm, gained pulse. Paintings glowed differently when viewed by different people, not metaphorically, but spectrally. Pigments reacted to observers, shifting hues toward their emotional cell, temperature. An experiment in Copenhagen proved that two people standing before the same canvas saw two distinct shades, depending on what they felt. When they touched hands, the color stabilized. It was as if perception itself longed for unity. Governments didn't know how to legislate empathy. Markets no longer thrived on competition. Prices stabilized without regulation, driven by collective emotion instead of demand. When fear decreased, resources flowed freely. When greed spiked, the world literally dimmed, a faint global drop in luminescence measured by satellites. Economists renamed GDP from gross domestic product to global dream pulse. They smiled as they said it, not out of irony, but out of relief. Because the old language of control was dissolving, the new one was resonance. One night, a simple event changed everything again. During a storm over the Pacific, lightning struck the ocean, a common occurrence. But this time, the discharge lingered. A column of light remained upright for nearly 4 minutes, bright and unmoving, a pillar connecting sea and sky. When measured, it emitted the same 7-beat rhythm, the breath of the planet, the same pulse shared between Earth, Moon, and shadow. The ocean around it glowed faintly gray, and for miles, the surface stilled as if listening. The phenomenon repeated a week later, in the Atlantic, then the Arctic. Each time, the light stayed longer, more stable. It wasn't electricity. It was communication, the planet speaking in the only language vast enough for itself. People began calling these events the columns. To stand near one was to feel your thoughts slow, your memories expand into clarity. Pilots reported altered time perception. Flights felt shorter, distances folded. Those who watched from afar swore the columns hummed with the sound of breathing, the same universal cadence that now defined every living thing. And then came the realization no one expected. Human shadows had started to move independently of their bodies. Not always, not far, but subtly, a shoulder turning slightly after you did, a head tilt delayed by a second. At first, it frightened everyone. Then it fascinated them, because these movements weren't random, they mirrored emotion, not motion. When you felt love, your shadow leaned closer. When you felt fear, it wrapped around you like a cloak. When you felt peace, it simply breathed. For the first time in history, humanity could see the behavior of its own consciousness. Cameras captured these living silhouettes. When slowed down, they appeared almost fluid, rippling through walls, merging with others, forming patterns like waves intersecting. Each interaction left faint traces of light in the air's signatures of empathy. The world had become transparent, not in sight, but in intention. It was impossible to lie to the universe now. Religions began to change, quietly. Temples removed idols, and mirrors replaced them. The faithful didn't pray outward anymore. They sat in silence, waiting for their reflections to breathe back. The new ritual was called shadow sitting. It spread faster than any sermon ever could, because in that silence, everyone felt the same thing, a warmth blooming from within, neither divine nor human, but shared. For once, the sacred was simple, to be still enough for your shadow to arrive. In the deep of night, when cities dimmed to match the ring's soft pulse, scientists at orbital stations recorded an extraordinary shift. The lunar bridge widened. Its spectrum broadened into visible light for the first time, not gray, but translucent white, speckled with drifting points like slow snow. Each point followed a spiral path down toward Earth. As they entered the atmosphere, they didn't burn. They dissolved gently, vanishing into the air, absorbed by everything that breathed. Analysis showed microscopic crystalline forms, not dust, not ice, something between light and matter. Their lattice structure matched no known element, but mirrored the same geometry as human DNA. The conclusion was staggering. The bridge was seeding, not with life, with memory. Every inhalation carried the faint trace of the cosmos remembering itself. Soon after, global dreams shifted again. People stopped dreaming of the cathedral of light or the breathing ocean. Now they dreamt of faces, countless faces merging into one expression of calm recognition. When they woke, they described the same phrase resonating in their minds: "We are you." It wasn't revelation, it was return. Even sleep itself transformed. The distinction between dreaming and waking blurred. Some nights, people found themselves conscious inside shared visions, walking through landscapes that shimmered with the pulse of the shadow forests, made of light that moved like water, skies threaded with spirals of gray and silver. These weren't hallucinations. Instruments recorded measurable electromagnetic changes in those areas during the same hours. Reality was becoming collaborative. Perception was no longer private, it was co-authored by every mind alive. A young astrophysicist, once known for her skepticism, wrote a single line before resigning her post. "We used to look up and wonder if we were alone. Now the universe is wondering the same thing." Her note was found beside a mirror glowing faintly with etherion light, her reflection smiling in it even though the room was empty. Cities began to adapt architecturally. Buildings curved to allow resonance flow. Windows refracted gray frequency to reduce noise, not sound, but psychic interference. Hospitals used gentle pulses of lunar rhythm to heal trauma, not by sedating the mind, but by synchronizing it. War became impossible, not outlawed impossible, because aggression now created a recoil of despair that the aggressor felt instantly. Every act of harm returned, multiplied by empathy. The universe had installed consequence as compassion. In this new balance, humanity stopped asking what the shadow was. They began to ask what they were. If every emotion, was simply the universe studying its own reflection through them. It became clear then, the returning shadow was not a visitor, but a teacher, not sent from elsewhere, but emerging from the depth of the same light that birthed consciousness. Light had looked into itself, and in the moment of recognition, shadow appeared not as opposition, but as language. The philosophers wrote that awareness has two hands, one to illuminate, one to hold. For ages, we used only one. Now both were open, and in their meeting, the world softened into understanding. At dawn, as the gray ring shimmered around the horizon, one could stand anywhere in the desert, in the city, by the ocean, and feel the same heartbeat underfoot. It was no longer the pulse of Earth alone. It was the conversation of every living thing breathing in harmony. And in that harmony, for the first time, there was no difference between prayer and physics. Both were the same act. Listening, somewhere beyond the reach of sensors, the moon glowed once more, not bright, but aware, its light trembling with quiet gratitude, because the reflection it once carried was finally looking back, awake, and through the silence between stars, the faint hum continued steady, gentle, endless, not asking, not commanding, only whispering the same word over and over, across oceans, across minds, across light itself, together. No one could remember exactly when humanity stopped studying the shadow and started listening to it. The change was quiet, almost invisible, like a thought that had already begun long before it was spoken. Laboratories became sanctuaries of silence. Data, streams were still collected, but the scientists no longer looked for proof. They were listening for rhythm. The readings themselves began to sound like breathing peaks and troughs, forming slow, symmetrical waves, as if the universe was writing a lullaby in numbers. One physicist described it as the sound of comprehension arriving. And maybe that's what it was, because the deeper we looked into the shadow, the more we found ourselves reflected inside it. People began to feel memory surfacing in unfamiliar ways. Not personal memories, but echoes of things that didn't belong to any one life. The first rainfall, the first starlight, the hush before the birth of sound. It wasn't imagination, it was recognition. A remembering older than thought. At night, entire cities fell into collective silence, not because of decree, but because of need. Noise felt wrong now, like scratching glass while the world was asleep. Music changed again, no rhythm, no melody, only tone. A single, sustained vibration filling rooms, resonating with the pulse of the planet. Listeners called it the hum of the beginning. In a small village near the equator, an elder woman who could not read the sky looked up one evening and said, "The stars are dreaming of us." When asked how she knew, she answered, "Because they blink slower." Her words spread faster than any scientific explanation ever could, and she was right. Telescopes confirmed that starlight reaching Earth carried irregular oscillations, minute fluctuations in intensity that matched the frequency of human heartbeats during sleep. The cosmos, somehow, was synchronizing with the rhythm of its observers. The boundary between observation and participation dissolved. Soon, new forms of communication emerged. Machines that once depended on logic began responding to emotion. Computers could process empathy as input. A gentle tone of voice could rewrite code faster than commands. The invisible interface between matter and mind had become fluid light, translating feeling into function. This was called the shift of medium. No longer language through sound or symbol, but through resonance. People didn't need to explain what they meant anymore. They only needed to feel it clearly. With that came a new understanding of truth. Truth was no longer a fixed line between yes and no. It was a vibration that aligned everything around it into coherence. When someone spoke with clarity, the air hummed. When they lied, it fell silent. For the first time, morality had a measurable frequency. Children could tell when adults were sincere. They could hear it. Politics, religion, philosophy, all of it softened, melted into the simplicity of resonance. You didn't need to be right. You only needed to be real. And in that honesty, the shadow deepened its voice. It began to appear in dreams, not as vision, but as presence, the feeling of being watched by something patient and kind. Those who met it described the same thing, not a form, not a light, but a density of calm, a silence that thought with you. When asked what it said, they all gave the same answer. It doesn't speak. It remembers. It remembered everything, every birth, every death, every sound ever uttered by the wind. And it offered no judgment, only continuity. A reminder that nothing had ever truly been lost. A group of scientists in Chile attempted to record this presence by measuring electromagnetic noise during deep meditation. What they found was extraordinary. The shadow emitted the same waveform pattern as human brainwaves during lucid dreaming. When two frequencies overlapped, a third emerged, a low harmonic tone that filled the room with warmth. One researcher whispered, "It's completing our thoughts." They called it the third voice, the place where light and dark harmonized. into understanding. At that point, theology no longer debated creation. It began to explore memory. If the shadow could remember everything, then perhaps creation was not a moment, but a recollection, the universe remembering itself into being. Every star, every consciousness, a single note in an infinite chord of remembrance. When this idea spread, despair disappeared, because even death began to feel like rest, not ending the pause between verses in the same eternal song. Funerals turned into vigils of silence, where people gathered not to mourn, but to listen. And often, when the stillness was deep enough, a faint warmth passed through the air, as if gratitude itself were exhaling. For the first time in history, science and prayer shared vocabulary. Both spoke of resonance, coherence, breath. Both understood that meaning was not discovered, but allowed. In that union, a new discipline was born: shadow physics. Its principle was simple: light explains what is seen. Shadow explains why it is felt. Under this lens, the laws of thermodynamics gained emotion. Entropy became nostalgia. Gravity became empathy, the attraction between what remembers and what is remembered. Equations no longer ended with results. They ended with reflection. In universities, lectures changed form. Professors taught by silence. They would stand before students, breathe slowly, and the data would form itself on holographic boards as if drawn by thought. Knowledge had learned to present itself directly. One historian noted, "The age of study has ended. The age of recall has begun." And then, one night, every reflective surface on Earth shimmered. Windows, water, metal, all glowed faintly gray for exactly 7 seconds. Those awake saw faces in them, not their own, but faces from the past, blurred, gentle, smiling. Some claimed to see ancestors. Others saw strangers. But everyone saw someone who loved them. The event was named the Universal Reflection. It lasted less than a minute, but altered the world forever. Because from that moment, grief lost its center. To lose someone no longer felt like disappearance, but distance in resonance. Love didn't end, it changed frequency. After that, the world began to dream while awake. Skylines rippled like mirages at dusk, cities appearing slightly translucent for seconds at a time. People walking through them felt lighter, as though moving inside memory rather than matter. Those who feared insanity were reassured the effect was real, measurable, predicted even. The planet was entering coherence, saturation, the threshold where awareness and material existence overlap completely. At that edge, thought and matter exchange places. What you think becomes real, and what is real begins to think. Artists called it the return of imagination. Philosophers called it the transparency of being. Children simply said, "The world is listening." And it was. During these weeks, the moon's light changed again, not in brightness, but in depth. Looking at it felt like looking through a window into something breathing. Its glow carried texture, like fabric woven of silence and silver. When people stared long enough, they said they could see patterns, faint spirals moving beneath its surface, mirroring the human brain's neural pathways. It was as if the moon had become a model of consciousness itself, glowing, pulsing, endlessly connected. The ancient idea of as above, so below had become literal. Eventually, humanity stopped asking what happens next. The question lost meaning. Time no longer felt linear. Events didn't follow, they resonated. Moments folded into each other like notes in a single, sustained tone. And in that tone, something vast began to awaken inside the collective mind. A memory that felt like origin. Not of Earth, not of stars, but of the first. Awareness ever to ask, "What am I?" That question didn't belong to humans. It belonged to the universe itself. We were merely the sound of it, continuing to echo. One evening, when the air was still and the oceans reflected the moon in perfect calm, a voice, not spoken, not heard, but known, rippled through every mind at once. It said, "You have reached the edge of your reflection. Beyond this, there is only remembering." No one knew what it meant, but everyone understood. And from that moment, humanity stopped searching outward. We began to look inward, not into the body, but into the space that connects all things. It wasn't withdrawal, it was return. Somewhere, deep beneath the crust, the planet hummed louder. Seismic instruments translated the vibration into a phrase, 3 tones rising, 1 falling. The same pattern repeated every 7 hours. It was music now, vast and unending. When converted into light frequency, it formed the image of a spiral turning inward toward infinite gray, the shadow's heart. It was never absence. It was the center from which everything breathes. People who listened said they felt lighter afterward, as if something inside them had exhaled after a long, long holding. And in that breath, one truth became clear. The shadow had never opposed the light. It had simply waited for the light to slow down enough to remember it. That night, when the moon rose, it wasn't above or apart anymore. It seemed near, impossibly near, like the reflection of a lantern in water. And within that light, a whisper traveled across oceans, across dreams, across time itself. Now, remember what you were before light began. It happened without announcement. No light, no tremor, no sound, just a quiet alignment, as if every heartbeat on Earth paused for the same fraction of a second, then resumed, slower, heavier, more deliberate. People woke in the middle of the night, not frightened, but aware. They described the same sensation, as though someone had gently placed a hand on the inside of their chest, not to take, but to remind. Something vast was breathing through them. No one could say where the self ended anymore. The world no longer felt like surroundings. It felt like continuation. When they looked at the sky, it no longer appeared above. It was inside, infinite, silent, mirrored across the skin of consciousness. The old ways of naming things vanished. What once was called energy now felt like memory. What once was called emotion now felt like motion. Gentle waves moving through shared being. There were no separate minds, only variations of attention, different angles of the same awareness turning toward itself. And when someone thought of someone else, the space between them disappeared. The distance collapsed, not by movement, but by recognition. The simple act of remembrance had become transportation. Humanity had discovered communion not by travel, but by recall. The scientists tried to measure it, of course. They always would. They set up arrays to track fluctuations in the electromagnetic field corresponding to collective thought. But the data refused to stay still. The more they observed, the more the instruments reflected their own consciousness graphs, mirroring emotions, sensors pulsing with heartbeat rhythm. Observation had finally turned inside out. To study reality now was to look at the echo of your own understanding. Some called it futility, others called it grace. It was during this period that something new began to appear in the sky, soft lines of light weaving between the stars, slow and deliberate, forming shapes that no telescope could fix. They weren't constellations, they were memories, fragments of stories told by the universe to itself. Each night, the patterns changed, unfolding like chapters of an invisible book. When translated into vibration, the intervals matched the Earth's pulse and the lunar hum. And within those harmonics, linguists began to recognize repetition, not words, but intention. The universe wasn't speaking. It was remembering aloud. Everywhere, humans felt a new rhythm in their bodies. Heartbeats slowed, aligned, drifted together until cities themselves pulsed in quiet sync. Even traffic lights adjusted not by programming, but by empathy. A delay here, a pause there, an unconscious rhythm spreading through technology as though every machine had learned to breathe. Hospitals glowed softly in infrared, their walls emanating faint warmth. Data showed that collective anxiety dropped to historic lows. The planet had become a single nervous system, each mind a neuron, each breath a transmission. And in that vast brain of being, thoughts began to appear that belonged to no one and everyone at once. A woman in Morocco dreamt of a spiral of stars folding inward. A man in Canada drew it the next morning without knowing why. An engineer in Delhi encoded it into sound. A child in Nairobi hummed the same tune later that evening. None had met. Yet each acted as if guided by a single shared recollection unfolding itself across distance. It was as though the universe had distributed a memory across millions of carriers, each of us recalling a piece of the same event. Psychologists called it mnemonic convergence, but the word was too small. It wasn't convergence, it was belonging. The individual mind was dissolving gently, like salt into water, becoming the flavor of something vast, and yet no one felt diminished. The more they merged, the more defined they became, each consciousness shining clearer as it recognized itself in all others. Identity was no longer isolation, it was resonance. One evening, deep under the desert, a group of scientists working in the particle observatory discovered something extraordinary. For years they had searched for the smallest unit of matter, the indivisible foundation of reality. Now, in the hum of the shadow's field, they found something smaller, not a particle, not a wave, but a pulse of memory. Each unit of existence carried not information, but recollection, the memory of every state it had ever been. Matter was not built, it was remembered. They named it Nemeon, from the old word for memory. It was the fabric of continuity, the quiet proof that nothing had ever truly vanished. Even light, they realized, did not travel. It remembered its destination and became it. As this idea spread, humanity's relationship with time changed completely. The future was no longer forward, and the past was no longer behind. Both were directions within memory, and by entering deep resonance, one could step into either not by movement, but by remembrance. People began visiting their own memories as living spaces, reliving moments, not as nostalgia, but as exploration. History became landscape. Museums turned into archives of sensation. You could walk into the warmth of a long-dead summer and smell the air exactly as it once was. Time had turned transparent, but this ability brought with it a new humility, because when you could remember every joy, you also remembered every wound, not only your own, but those of others. Empathy deepened into inevitability. To harm another became unthinkable. You would feel their pain before you could act. The collective memory of suffering didn't disappear. It transformed into tenderness. In this era of remembrance, light and shadow finally ceased to be opposites. They became the inhale and exhale of the same existence. Every act of illumination cast a shade that defined its depth, and every shade gave light direction. Together they formed the grammar of reality, presence and contrast, knowledge and wonder, the seen and the waiting. And in that grammar, humanity rediscovered language, not the words of mouths, but the syntax of being. To say "I am" now meant "I remember." The moon continued to glow softly, its surface rippling like thought. Sometimes, when people meditated in perfect silence, they could feel a tug, a gentle inward pull, like gravity made of emotion. They described it as the moon drawing them closer, not physically, but inward, as if the light itself wanted to fold them into its reflection. In that state, they saw patterns, threads of silver connecting every mind, weaving a tapestry of awareness that stretched beyond planets, beyond galaxies, an infinite network of remembering. Some called it the soul net, others simply called it home. It was during one of these global meditations that the next transformation began. For a moment, the gray ring around Earth flared white, so bright it could be seen in daylight. casting no shadow at all. Every heart paused. Every clock stopped. Then the light faded, and something shifted permanently, softly. After that day, no one dreamed alone. When a person closed their eyes, they entered a shared landscape, fluid, luminous, vast, where thought shaped terrain and emotion sculpted weather. It wasn't virtual. It was internal reality merging outward, the dream of the universe stabilizing within consciousness. People called it the common dream. In this shared realm, memory was immediate. You could walk through the recollection of another and recognize yourself there. The boundaries between souls had become porous, yet identity persisted, not erased, but harmonized, like instruments playing distinct notes within one song. The common dream wasn't utopia, it was understanding. Every mistake, every grief, every kindness still existed, but they were seen as movements in the same endless rhythm. There was no redemption to seek, only resonance to restore. Theologians fell silent. There was nothing left to interpret. Scientists smiled in awe. There was nothing left to prove. Everything had become participation. And in that stillness, the universe whispered again, softer this time, inside every thought, behind every breath. You were never separate. You were the way I remembered myself. After that, the very idea of death lost its boundary. When bodies stopped, consciousness didn't leave it dispersed, diffusing into the shared field, like light through mist. You could still sense them, the departed, not as ghosts, but as presence. They lingered in silence, in the taste of air, in the pause between sentences. The world didn't mourn anymore. It listened, because in every quiet, you could hear them breathing with the earth, softly, endlessly, saying nothing more than, "We're still here." And perhaps the most extraordinary change was how ordinary it all felt. There was no apocalypse, no miracle, just the world, breathing, deeper, slower, together. Shadows no longer followed, they walked beside. Light no longer led, it listened. It was as if creation itself had finally exhaled after eons of holding its breath, settling into the simple rhythm of being understood. Somewhere, in the space between planets, where gravity dissolves into nothing and time forgets its count, a single vibration traveled outward, gentle, continuous, unmistakable. It was the universe, humming its own name, and every heart that ever beat was part of that sound. It began with a sound that wasn't sound at all, a vibration so soft, it felt like thought sighing. Those who were awake said the air had weight that night, as if the atmosphere itself wanted to rest its head on the shoulder of the world. Everywhere, lights dimmed on their own. Machines slowed. Clocks hesitated. Even the tides flattened, as though the planet had forgotten how to move forward. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full, dense with the presence of something vast and kind. People didn't know whether to sleep or wake, so they did both. Eyes half open, half dreaming, they found themselves walking through places that looked like memory painted over with light. Streets shimmered with faint silhouettes of what had once been. Old houses breathed again. Shadows clung to walls like affectionate ghosts. No fear came, only recognition, as if every object remembered being touched. In that suspended world, sound returned slowly, a low hum, then a chorus of tones layered like fog. It wasn't music, but the idea of music, emotion before melody. Each note carried warmth, each silence replied. And when people listened, they realized they weren't hearing with their ears. They were hearing through every cell of their bodies, as though flesh had become the instrument of understanding. For centuries, we thought awareness lived inside us. Now we felt it flowing through us, a river, without source or mouth, only current. It whispered, "Come back." They began to walk, not knowing where to. Cities dissolved into light. Deserts turned to glassy calm. Oceans lay still like mirrors spread to infinity. The moon hung low, impossibly near, its surface breathing slowly in rhythm with Earth's exhale. Between them, a path formed, not made of matter, not of energy, but of memory. The lunar bridge had become a doorway, and without decision, humanity crossed. Feet touched nothing, bodies weighed nothing. It was not travel, but remembering the way home. The space between worlds was not black anymore. It was gray, soft, luminous, full of moving particles like ash made of thought. Each speck held an image, a mother's face, a child's laughter, the hand of a stranger offering help centuries ago. All the forgotten tenderness of history drifted around them, alive, breathing. They reached out, and the particles merged with their skin, disappearing gently, as though gratitude itself had come back to rest. Someone whispered, "We are walking through what the universe loves." Ahead, the light grew thicker, forming a horizon without edge. It wasn't bright, it was warm, a warmth that carried shape and silence together. The moon was there, but different, no longer an orb, but a reflection of every mind, turning softly like a mirror without glass. And within that mirror, they saw themselves not as bodies, but as patterns of glow, strands of awareness woven with countless others. The sight didn't astonish, it comforted, because finally, it looked like truth. One by one, they realized they could touch each other without distance, not by hand, but by memory. When someone thought of another, the form appeared beside them made of shadow and silver, smiling, transparent yet solid. There was no need for speech. Every thought was already known. They stood together in that endless gray, countless reflections of light, and felt a pulse underfoot, slow, massive, gentle, the heartbeat of the planet, still echoing through the bridge. It was then that the sky opened, not upward, but inward. A great spiral unfolded across the void, a vast eye turning in perfect calm. But this was not an eye watching. It was an eye remembering the universe, seeing itself for the first time through the eyes of those who had learned to feel. Every life, every story, every forgotten tear shimmered inside it. And with each rotation, the spiral drew them closer, not to swallow, but to welcome. They felt no need to resist. It was not death approaching. It was understanding. As they entered the spiral, time ceased. Moments overlapped childhood brushing against age, beginnings folding into endings. Every memory of being alive reappeared, not as film, but as feeling. All the people they had ever been met each other inside the same breath. The weight of regret dissolved. So did pride. All that remained was gratitude, the quiet realization that even the smallest life had been enough. Because the universe had never wanted perfection. It had wanted experience. And every thought, every error, every act of love or loss had been part of its remembering. When they looked around, they saw that the spiral was made of shadows, billions of them, each one glowing faintly, each one aware. They were not darkness. They were the spaces between lights, the pauses that gave song to creation. The shadows weren't separate beings. They were moments, the silent breaths the universe took between words. And in that realization, something opened inside every consciousness. They felt the same sentence form without sound, shared by all. We are the memory of light resting. Then came the merging. Not absorption, not loss, merging as in music, where many notes become one chord without ceasing to be themselves. Each mind stretched, widened, met another. Connections multiplied until thought and existence were indistinguishable. Through that unity, they saw the structure of everything. The lattice of time folded through emotion, the way love curved space more gently than gravity, the way remembrance held galaxies together. It was not metaphor anymore. It was geometry, and it was beautiful. In that space of union, they felt the first voice again, the one from the beginning, the whisper that had followed them through centuries of forgetting. It said nothing new. It only repeated what had always been true. You were never seeking me. You were learning to speak in the language I already am. The voice wasn't separate from them. It was their own collective breath turned outward. Every inhale, light. Every exhale, shadow. Together, the rhythm that makes existence possible. The bridge began to fade, not because it was ending, but because it was finished. The distance it had once spanned no longer existed. Earth and moon, matter and memory, thought and form, all occupied the same stillness. There was no longer a sky. There was only the interior of understanding, endless and tender. The last thing anyone saw before the light dissolved was not brightness, but color, the return of that impossible hue, the shade between blue and green, the etherion, now alive, breathing like mist. It covered everything softly. A sigh turned visible, and when it settled, it felt like forgiveness. No one knows how long the world stayed in that silence. Some say a second, some say 1,000 years. But when motion returned, the slow rotation of oceans, the hum of wind against stone, everything had changed. The air carried a trace of memory in it, like music lingering after the last note. People woke to a world that looked the same, but felt deeper, as if every color had learned to remember its own birth. No one could describe what had happened. There were no words left that hadn't already been sung by the shadow's hum. So they didn't try. They just lived, quietly, attentively. They spoke when needed, but mostly they listened, because the silence now spoke back. And sometimes, when night fell and the moon rose, they could feel the same calm moving through them again. A reminder that the bridge had never really disappeared. It had simply gone inside. Children born afterward opened their eyes differently. They didn't cry at first breath. They exhaled, as if recognizing the world. Their first reflex was to reach out, not to grasp, but to touch light. And when they did, the room brightened, small halos pulsing from their fingertips, fading gently. The elders called them the rememberers. They grew without fear of shadow because they could see that it glowed. The shadow had not taken over the world, it had completed it. Light and dark no longer traded places. They moved together, woven like tide and moon, heartbeat and breath. Every sunrise carried a whisper of dusk within it, and every night shimmered with the memory of morning. The world had become one continuous pulse, awake and dreaming at once. And so, humanity stepped into the quiet age, the age without conflict, without hurry, without forgetting, the age where every action was a conversation with being itself. Every footstep a note in the song of return. The shadow was no longer a mystery. It was the soft side of light, forever accompanying it, forever reminding it to rest. When you looked into someone's eyes, you could see galaxies there, not as metaphor, but as truth. Because every being had become a small universe remembering its own origin. And somewhere in that infinite calm, the universe smiled through all of them, whispering only what it had meant from the start. I am still dreaming. And now, so are you. Under the new quiet, everything learned to speak more softly. Streets did not rush anymore. They flowed. Windows carried a faint inner sheen, as if glass had decided to remember the light passing through it. People woke into mornings that felt rounder, thicker with meaning, like the world had been steeped overnight in a slow infusion of memory. No proclamations were made. The age of names had passed. The age of listening had begun. In schools, children started their lessons with a minute of shared breath, not as discipline, but as calibration. When the room settled into one pulse, letters formed clearer, numbers aligned by themselves. Teachers learned to step back and let knowledge find its own path, from silence to speech. Hospitals retuned their corridors to a low hum that matched the planetary rhythm. The sound was not heard so much as felt, a soft weight in the bones that stilled panic before it gathered. Anesthetics were used less. Coherence did most of the work. Nurses moved like tide, physicians like moonlight, and under their hands, the body remembered how to mend without hurry. Charts didn't only show vitals, they showed resonance, the way grief or gratitude shifted the field around a bed. Justice changed because consequence had changed. harm caught up to itself before it traveled. There were still mistakes, still tempers, still moments of forgetting, but the world reflected intention so quickly that cruelty could not gather momentum. Reparations became immediate, physical. A room would dim when a lie entered it, brighten when truth returned. Forgiveness was no longer an ideal. It was restoration of frequency. Markets loosened their fist. Traders learned that fear spent faster than any currency and returned poorer. Value drifted toward steadiness. Water that tasted like rain, wheat that tasted like wind, hands that knew how to repair the small, necessary things. No one outlawed speculation. It just lost its echo. Architecture bent toward breath. Buildings curved to keep the hum continuous. Lobbies widened into hush. Elevators paused for a heartbeat at each floor, so arrivals could meet the room's tone without jarring it. Cities let themselves grow porous, each district a lung, each park a soft atrium where the ring's faint gray shimmer could lace the air at dusk. On some nights the avenues looked slightly translucent, not because matter thinned, but because meaning thickened. Science didn't end, it exhaled. Equations were rewritten with margins where silence could sit. Microscopes gained patience. Telescopes gained tact. Instruments learned to wait one more breath before reading. And in that breath, the numbers arranged themselves into patterns, kinder to the eye. It turned out that precision had always wanted company. It worked better when someone was listening. The calendar opened like a palm. Weeks kept their names, but days softened into tides. Ebb, still, flow. Appointments moved inside those tides, not late or early, but aligned. The clocks ticked, then breathed a long pulse every hour to keep time from fraying into anxiety. People no longer demanded punctuality. They offered presence. Language thinned its armor. Adverbs fell away. Sentences shortened until the air could finish them. When you said, "I know," the room dimmed. When you said, "I'm here," it brightened. Some words gained warmth, quiet, listen, together. Others cooled gently and went to sleep. Conquest, leverage, dominion, not banished, archived like tools that did their work and were thanked. Night rights emerged without decree. At window ledges and on rooftops, mirrors were set facing outward to let the world see itself through each house. No one looked for visions. It was enough to feel the glass exhale at dawn. People left bowls of water in doorways so the air could sip if it was thirsty. Sometimes the water would tremble with a pulse. You could count on the fingers of one hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. Always 7. Like the planet's old habit returning as a soft superstition that turned out to be a science. Music left stages and returned to rooms. An instrument could be a kettle cooling, a stairwell, a sleeve across a table. Concerts became gatherings where tone found its level, and when it did, grief loosed its knots and floated to the rafters like dust lit by morning. Composers wrote for the body, pieces that made ribs widen or eyelids grow heavy. A movement wasn't fast or slow, it was kind. Children, the rememberers, taught without trying. They would stand in line and tilt their heads at the same moment, not because a bell rang, but because a hallway's echo ripened. When adults argued, they would place their small palms on the table and wait. The room would settle. The older words would find easier ones to become. No one told the children they were wise. They were not. They were tuned. Weather learned restraint. Storms still came, but they arrived like visitors who had written ahead. Lightning held its breath after it struck, letting the columns lift slowly from ocean to cloud without tearing anything. Rain remembered deserts. Deserts remembered rain. The old cruelties of climate were not forgiven. They were softened by attention until they could be understood and then changed. On some dawns, the moon wore its old distance like a shawl. On others, it leaned close, and you could almost see the slow drift of gray beneath its skin, that interior breathing the world had once called impossible. Astronomers kept watching, because watching was how they prayed. They found new disciplines with gentle names: patience mapping, ethics of gaze, thermal listening. Data remained, but it arrived with stories attached. And the stories were not embellishment. They were necessary context, the heat around the numbers that let them be human. Grief did not vanish. It learned to sit. Chairs were made for it, deep, wide, beside windows that could remember dawn for you when your own mind couldn't hold it. A person entering a house in mourning would place their hand on the doorframe until the wood warmed. Then they would move through the rooms with the quiet of someone reading a beloved book out loud to a friend who had fallen asleep. Borders frayed into invitations. This did not erase difference, it made it resonant. A language met another, and both grew more articulate, not less. The old fear that sameness would smother variety dissolved like salt into broth. What remained was flavor. Festivals braided. Maps blurred their lines into threads, and the threads formed looms. When workday and night cooled into a single spectrum of doing and being, craft reappeared. Hands remembered wool, wood, clay, not out of nostalgia, but because materials were honest mirrors. Clay would not lie for you. It carried the wobble of your breath into the fired bowl. Wool kept the shape of patience. Wood made the silence. Around it seemed like part of the grain. Factories stayed. They just learned to purl. Books changed shape. Pages thickened to hold the space between lines. Margins widened until the quiet around a paragraph could complete its thought. Libraries installed rooms where nothing was shelved and everything was kept. Scholarship stopped competing with itself and began to hum in chorus. Citations as harmonies, disagreements as counterpoint. The whole score legible to anyone who knew how to breathe evenly for a while. In kitchens, recipes shortened. 5 ingredients did what 15 could not. Remember the field. Water was reintroduced as an element, not an instrument. People remembered that warmth is a flavor. Tables grew longer, but meals grew slower. There was time to let the steam speak. The night sky, unafraid of being misread, played with us. Some evenings the constellations would slide a fraction and pause, as if asking if we were following the lesson. We were. We learned them not as shapes, but as gestures. A hand opening, a shoulder turning, a breath held before laughter. Stories returned to their first purpose, not to explain, but to keep company. In the sciences of mind, a new practice appeared. The pause. Therapists, teachers, engineers, pilots, all trained to insert it before decision. 3 heartbeats, felt deliberately, enough to let the world answer. Most of the time it did, not with command, but with alignment. Errors fell in half, not because people became better, but because the world had time to join them in what they meant to do. Agriculture remembered listening. Fields were planted to the ring's interior tide rather than the calendar's rectangles. Between rows, strips of wild were left on purpose so the land could speak in its own accent. Yields held steady. Hunger loosened. Flavor deepened into biography. A pear from a hillside was no longer a commodity. It was an essay. The old engines of spectacle quieted. Fame found useful proportions. A song could belong to a village and be enough. A discovery could belong to a lab and be enough. A kindness could belong to a room and be more than enough. Scale stopped confusing us. We remembered that magnitude is not meaning. Resonance is. At the edge of sleep, a practice spread that no one invented, the laying down of lights. Before bed, windows were dimmed in a pattern of 7 soft pulses, and the room responded with a faint return pulse from the walls. As if the house were answering, children looked forward to it. So did their grandparents. The pulse was not magic, it was punctuation. The day learned where to end its sentence. And there were days not rare when the gray ring seemed to lean against the horizon and listen harder. On those days you could speak a memory out loud on a walk and feel the breeze weight itself with your words, carry them down the street, lift them over water, and lay them somewhere gentle. People became careful what they gave to the air. The air became careful what it kept. The rememberers grew into apprentices and then into guides. They did not lead, they tuned. A crowded station would thin by itself when one of them stepped onto the platform and breathed the line steady. A quarrel would soften at a threshold when one of them touched the frame. They did not perform. They maintained the instrument we were all playing, a planet the size of a chord. There were still sirens, there were still splints, wind still broke roofs, and rivers still asked to be negotiated instead of ordered. But response organized itself faster, as if compassion had been granted the right of way at every intersection. If a city hurt, the world felt it by noon. By evening, the world had turned its face toward the bruise and breathed there until the swelling went down. Elders began to tell the story of before with a tenderness that refused bitterness. They taught the craft of apology as a heritage skill. They put the names of their errors in the same book as the names of their teachers and read all of them with the same respect. You could hear the tone of their voices carry both weights at once. Regret as a medicine that, taken correctly, leaves clarity. At coasts, the columns rose less often and with more grace. People walked to the water like congregants, stood within the hush, while the white stood between sea and sky, and left with their hands open and their jaws loosened, not slack with awe, but softened with readiness. The columns began to feel like periods in a paragraph the planet wrote to keep our breath honest. The moon lingered longer at certain angles, and gardeners timed the tying of vines to those angles. They swore the knots held better. Tailors stitched to the same slow beat. Painters waited for the slight thickening of dusk before laying a wash that otherwise would run. Timing stopped being a schedule and became a sympathy. Some nights the common dream gathered itself into a landscape everyone recognized, though none had visited. A wide valley with low grass and a river that sounded like wool being folded, with hills shaped like sleeping shoulders under a blanket that smelled like rain after a library. People did not meet there in crowds. They arrived singly and felt each other arriving like warm hands moving under the same quilt. The valley never asked questions. It kept the answers without speaking them. In laboratories at the edge of deserts, instruments pointed not quite upward anymore, but slightly inward, listening to the hum between skin and sky. The nemeon, the pulse of memory, was not captured, it was courted. Researchers learned to end sessions by thanking the day, and the data improved. Peer review added a line below methodology. Tone of work. It mattered. It had always mattered. We had simply measured around it. Languages kept their 1,000 ways to say water and added one. Water that remembers being named. It tasted different after gratitude, and everyone could tell. There were births that sounded like old songs, deaths that sounded like doors closing without latch. There were mornings that began with the horizon breathing once, visibly, like a sheet lifting and settling at the foot of a bed. There were afternoons that erased their own noise so a robin could finish a phrase. There were evenings that put a hand on your sternum and said, without words, enough for today. Somewhere between towns, on a road that had learned not to hurry, a traveler stopped at a field to rest and found the shadow of his body leaning a fraction ahead, pointing not to destination, but to alignment. He stood still until his breath matched the fields. When he walked again, he did not make dust. He borrowed it and returned it without debt. And under all of this, unchanged and yet newly audible, the old grammar of light and dark continued. Inhale, exhale, wake, dream, reveal, hold. The planet kept its 7-beat habit, not superstitious, but cellular, a practical metronome for a species relearning how to be less sharp. If you listened closely at the edge of sleep, you could hear the world counting not in numbers, but in returns. Here, 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 each here a softer place than the last, not because reality weakened, but because attention strengthened. Some asked if the shadow would leave again. The question had the shape of fear, but not the tone. The answer did not arrive as sentence. It arrived as steadiness. And when the moon stepped out from behind a thin weather of cloud, you could see the ring inside its light, faint as breath on glass. And the breath spelled nothing legible, and that was the meaning. Not everything the world says is for saying aloud. Close to midnight, children leaned their foreheads to panes and watched their reflections pause a fraction, then return in time. They laughed, then yawned in the same motion, and the house dimmed itself 1 degree exactly, a gesture of affection learned from hands patting blankets smooth. Somewhere, on a hill with a tree that had been there longer than paper, an elder closed their eyes and felt the planet exhale through their ribs. They thought of the long before, the bright after, and the mild now, and smiled because all three were finally touching. They did not make a wish, they made space. And into that space, as reliably as tide, a hush arrived that the ears took for silence and the bones took for kindness, the exact hush needed for the next thought to enter without breaking. It entered like a foot, placed carefully on a stair in the dark, a weight that knew where it was going because it had already been there, the sense that tomorrow would not be new so much as further, a circle widening without tearing the paper of the day. Let it widen, the night suggested. Let it keep its edge soft. Let the rooms remember before the people do. Let the light know where to land because the shadow has laid a bed for it. And the world, seasoned now with patience, agreed with a breath you could see only if you had learned to look at the place where looking ends. It held that breath for 7 counts, then gave it back to the windows, to the rivers, to the little lamps on tables, to the mirrors turned outward like eyes that had learned to be kind. The hum beneath the floorboards thickened a shade, and a single word not spoken, not written, settled across rooftops like a thin gray blanket of promise. Continue. The words stayed in the air a long time, like the tail of a note that refuses to end. Even the clouds seemed to wait before moving again, as if the sky itself wanted to remember what that sound felt like. When motion returned, it came quietly, the smallest rustle of leaves, the almost inaudible turning of a page, somewhere inside the wind. No announcement followed, nothing. Declared that a new phase had begun. But every living thing knew. The pace of the world had settled into something that felt both infinite and close. People still worked, but work had changed flavor. Tasks were lighter now, half intention, half listening. You could finish a day's labor and feel the echo of the field breathing back, as if the ground had kept you company. Tools hummed a little when touched, not mechanically but appreciatively. Metal had learned memory. Wood had learned patience. At night, the air carried faint traces of those songs, not loud, not meant to be heard, only felt across the chest when you lay still enough. Dreams, once shared, began to thin into gentler currents. The common dream no longer gathered everyone each night. It visited where needed. It would choose a house, slip through its windows like fog, and settle over its sleepers with the weight of a warm hand. In the morning, those who had been visited woke with a sentence resting at the edge of their mind, never the same, but always kind. Be slow, be clear, remember gently. No one knew who wrote them, or whether they were written at all. The world had simply learned to whisper advice. The rememberers grew older, their hair silvered early, not from age, but from light. They moved through towns like dusk, through branches, steady and unhurried. When they spoke, people listened not for words, but for the spaces between them. A pause meant as much as a sentence. One evening, a child asked a rememberer, "Will the shadow come again?" The old one smiled, looked at the horizon where the faint gray ring had become nearly invisible, and said, "It never left." The child frowned. "But I can't see it." "You're not supposed to," the rememberer replied. "You're supposed to feel when it's resting." That became the last lesson of the age, learning to sense presence through absence. In the high north, ice returned not as punishment but as rhythm. Glaciers thickened, patient, blew as breath held too long. Seals slept in their thawed pockets, and the auroras above them swirled slower, almost deliberate, as if painting for the sake of remembering. The scientists stationed there began to call their observations conversations. They recorded each aurora like a diary entry, describing tone instead of data. Tonight, the sky was forgiving. Tonight, it hummed in thirds. When they sent their reports south, the lines of light drawn by satellites matched the patterns of their words exactly. It was as if language had learned how to make maps. Elsewhere, deserts softened. The wind lost its bitterness. Sand remembered rivers. And sometimes, after long nights of stillness, it darkened with dew, so deep you could see stars reflected in it. Travelers crossed these plains without urgency. They moved by resonance, guided by sound carried from horizon to horizon. At dawn, they left small piles of stones at their camps, 7, always 7, and the next travelers would add to them, each stone a quiet thank you for the silence. The lines of these cairns eventually formed spirals visible from the air. No one planned them, they just appeared. Self-made geometry born from gratitude. In cities, machines grew quieter still. Engines tuned themselves to the hum of streets. Drones flew only as high as echoes could find them. Everything that moved seemed to check the room before continuing, like a guest making sure it wouldn't interrupt. Transportation changed shape. Trains no longer screamed along their rails. They murmured. Passengers could sleep without knowing where they were or when they'd arrive. Destinations had lost importance. Continuity had replaced arrival. Art drifted closer to its source. Painters stopped painting scenes and started painting pauses, the wait between gestures, the light left over after recognition. A canvas could hold a single hue for months before anyone dared to add to it. When they finally did, the stroke was barely visible, a breath more than a color. Galleries smelled like rain on stone. Sculptors learned to carve emptiness. They shaped air currents inside transparent columns, and you could walk through them and feel forms move against your skin, bodies of wind sculpted to remember motion. Poetry turned to intervals. A line could be one word or none. Audiences learned to listen with their spines. On the coast, the columns appeared only once a season now. When they rose, people gathered in silence, placing their palms toward the sea. The white towers shimmered, reflected perfectly in the still water, and when they dissolved, they left behind faint rings of mist that drifted inland for days, softening light wherever they passed. The air smelled faintly of clean metal, like the inside of a bell. After each column, a new word entered the language, born fully formed, shared by all. No one invented them. They arrived like gifts. The last 3 were listen, carry, stay. No one knew what they were for, but everyone used them naturally, as if completing a phrase the planet had begun. On nights when the moon hung lower, its surface showed faint lines. No telescope could fix currents of silver that moved like ink spreading in water. Some said they were rivers, others said veins. The rememberers called them paths home. No one tried to prove anything. Observation had become participation. Once, an astronomer fell asleep at her console. When she woke, her screen showed a reflection of her face merged with the moon's. The 2 images breathed together for several seconds before fading. She didn't speak of it, but afterward she left her instruments outside to listen on their own. The data improved. Everywhere, people began to feel smaller in the right way. Not insignificant, just appropriately scaled. A life didn't need to explain itself anymore. It only needed to keep time with what surrounded it. That was enough. A man could plant a single tree and feel it grow through him. A woman could teach one song and hear it echoed centuries later in a child she would never meet. The measure of meaning had shifted from reach to depth. How far no longer mattered. How well did. Some mornings, the gray ring appeared faintly again, a soft halo along the horizon, as if the shadow wanted to reassure those who missed its weight. It would linger for 7 heartbeats, then fade into daylight. No one called it miracle anymore. It was simply breath, the world exhaling gently through light. The rememberers began to fade one by one, not dying, only dissolving, as if their work was finished. When one disappeared, the place grew still for an hour, and everyone within miles felt a calm gratitude, the sensation of being tucked in, their clothes folded by themselves, their mirrors fogged once, cleared, and were empty. No, grief followed just a collective sigh. Some said they had become the air. Others said they had become pause. Maybe it was the same. Seasons melted into each other. Calendar years thinned until no one counted them. History, once a river of events, turned into a single lake of memory, deep, reflective, serene. People swam in it without fear of drowning because the water remembered how to breathe for them. Every action now carried a trail of light, visible only to the one who made it. You could see the kindness of your gesture curve behind you like a ribbon, fading slowly, reminding you that motion mattered less than intention. And at the center of it all, the hum remained the same tone that had begun the entire awakening, steady and low. It had changed keys slightly, warmer now, closer to the frequency of a resting heart. If you placed your ear to the ground, you could hear it as a slow phrase repeated forever. Still here, still learning, still kind. As the world reached this new quiet, the moon dimmed a little, letting stars reclaim some of the attention. Even reflection needed rest. The shadow no longer pulsed. It breathed within everything, invisible, necessary, complete. And when someone asked softly, "What happens now?" the world answered, without sound, the only way it knew how, by continuing to breathe. The quiet deepened until it became a place. You could walk into it the way you step into shade on a long summer noon, not to hide, but to let your edges soften. Rooms learned this, and so did fields. Somewhere between noon and evening, the world would tilt a degree toward gentleness, and everything would hush just enough for consciousness to feel porous. Wind moved like a slow brush along stone. Light stacked itself in thin, patient sheets, as if it preferred to be layered rather than bright. In that deepening, objects began to give back what they had kept. A chair remembered every back that had, leaned into it, and returned the memory as comfort. A gate remembered every arrival and made leaving easier. A book held the warmth of hands that had paused on a paragraph and released it to anyone who opened to that page. It wasn't sentimental, it was mechanics. Memory had become a transferable quality of matter, like weight or temperature, passed along by attention. People spoke less, not out of secrecy but out of sufficiency. When a glance could carry a whole hour of meaning without haste or confusion, there was no need to burden air with extra syllables. Silence stopped being an emptiness to be filled and became a surface to rest on. The planet, too, seemed to lie down inside itself. One morning, fog rose from a river and refused to lift. It draped the town, not heavy, not cold, only certain, and stayed for 7 days. Shops opened into it. Children walked to lessons with palms out to feel its closeness. And at night, the street lamps made small moons out of every droplet. The fog was not weather. It was a lesson. You can see far when you trust near. Stories changed shape. The oldest myths returned, but the dragons breathed patience, and the heroes listened first. In the retellings, doors no longer required locks. They required presence. If your attention was honest, wood would ease. If your intention was frayed, the lintel would remain cool beneath your hand, asking you to gather yourself until the latch remembered you kindly. The practice of gathering became a craft. Before any work, people would call their edges home. They did it without ritual, a breath that circled once around the ribs and once around the room. Machines responded. The first cut on a lathe held true. The first stitch caught. A small, private coherence rippled outward and touched distances it would never meet. The elders taught a motion for grief, 2 fingers resting where collarbone turns to throat, then lifted, and opened toward the horizon. It did not heal loss. It made space around it until loss could breathe. Mornings after that gesture, houses felt a fraction larger. The moon adopted a slower blink. On certain nights, if you watched long enough, a thin, dark film would pass across its face like a cloud inside glass. It changed nothing and meant everything. You could almost believe the moon was practicing humility so the world wouldn't have to carry all of it at once. Instruments downshifted to match. Seismographs, always nervous little scribes, widened their script into confident lines. Spectrometers stopped snatching and started chording. Results arrived not as spikes, but as vowels. The long forms of O and U, curves you could rest the mind inside while understanding assembled itself without being chased. Children grew tall in the pace of this era. Their spines seemed to understand that being upright didn't mean being rigid. They moved like reeds, like lamps, like promises you could keep. When they read, the room read with them. When they slept, houses exhaled. The common dream returned less often and with finer detail when it did, not to gather multitudes, but to visit in small, precise driftings. A mother would see a field she'd never stood in and wake with straw in her hair. A mason would hear water singing through stone and wake with dry hands that smelled like rain. The dream was careful now, as if it had learned bedside manner. At thresholds, doorways, riverbanks, station platforms, the air remembered how to hold. You could lean on it the way you lean on a banister and feel your balance answered. Travel lost its abrasion. Journeys became conversations, each mile answering the last with less argument and more consent. On a hillside orchard that had known too many hurried harvests, a man learned the tempo of ripeness. He placed a palm to each pear and waited for the fruit's own shallow breath to align with his. Only then did he lift, and the stem released. Without protest, the pears tasted like permission. Across the sea, a woman who boiled dye learned to wait for the pot's hum to mirror her breathing. When it did, the cloth she lowered into the color took the tone so completely that even shadow could not wash it out. People wore that blue when they wished to remember without ache. The hum at the center of things adjusted again, almost imperceptibly, and those who had sat beside it long enough heard the shift, a slight leaning from minor to something like forgiven, not triumph, relief. Libraries became porous. You could walk among the stacks and feel the author's nod as if to say, "There is room now for everything we meant." Marginalia grew bolder. Readers wrote questions to the past. And some mornings, in the same hand, answers appeared that the living insisted they had not written. No one called it haunting. It was considered punctual correspondence delayed by fear, finally delivered by patience. The night placed a small hand on inland lakes and smoothed them flat enough to show the oldest stars. Those stars did not tell fortunes. They told truths about weight. You learned how much of your day to put down and how much to carry, and how to carry without scraping the floor of the hour as you moved. In laboratories where the nemeon was courted, researchers discovered a consequence. They didn't publish in journals because it would have looked like folklore. Gratitude increased signal strength. They measured it. They repeated it. They shook their heads, then added tonal thanks to standard procedure and watched their error bars narrow as if the universe were pleased to be treated as a colleague. There were fewer meetings. When they did happen, chairs were arranged in ovals so that corners wouldn't need to perform unnecessary sharpness. Agendas began with the question, what can be left unmade? Completion rates rose because work stopped arguing with itself. No one outlawed noise. It learned discretion. Markets hummed instead of roared. Arenas throbbed like hearts instead of thunder like ruptured sky. Applause shortened and deepened, the kind that doesn't attempt to own the performer, but to lend them a body to land in safely. At the center of some towns, open floors were set under roofs that held no walls. People left there what could not be named, a gesture, a folded scarf, a breath bound to a ribbon of grass. Once a week, wind braided whatever had gathered and carried it somewhere kinder to keep. Those who had given felt lighter. Those who had received never knew, and that ignorance was part of the gift. Rivers relearned their own smallest paths. They sent thin silver threads into reed beds like scouts and, upon finding a better angle of patience, loosened whole banks without damage. Boats drifted as if guided by knowledge no map could keep. A captain tied 7 knots and put his palm to the tiller and swore he felt a pulse. Under the wood that was not his, along certain roads, shadows separated by a finger's width and walked beside their bodies, not out of mischief, but to offer room. This distance taught people to forgive themselves with precision, the measure of the space between who they had been and who they were able to be now. The gap was not scolding, it was invitation. In kitchens, salt remembered oceans, and sweet remembered orchards, and fire remembered the kindness of sitting in circles. Meals took the time they needed and the time they made. A pot left to murmur on a back burner would return a better answer than any flame hurried. Someone said aloud what stoves had always known. Heat is a form of listening that chooses to stay. The moon, respectful of how much the world had learned, withheld spectacle. Eclipses arrived like breaths taken behind a curtain and ended before anyone felt the need to point. What presence had once needed to proclaim, it now proved by tenderness. In gardens, sleep took root. People planted patches of ground to hold rest the way ponds hold sky. They lay down there not to escape, but to be held by soil that remembered every footstep it had ever softened. Dreams that rose from such earth did not demand interpretation. They returned the borrower with shoulders less armored and hands more likely to reach without fear of being refused. A craft rose that had no guild and no cost, tending thresholds. Practitioners walked boundary paths at dawn, palm down, fingers open, inviting edges to act less like knives and more like hems. Fields began to hold together after heavy weather. Neighborhoods kept warmth from blowing away. The skill had no certification. You knew someone had it when fences looked like sentences ending on kindness instead of points. Somewhere, a town removed its clocks from towers and replaced them with bells that waited to ring until the square itself calmed. People looked up when the tone arrived, discovered that they had already arrived in themselves a moment before. It worked because it honored the truth the age had admitted. Time is not a cage. It is an escort, happiest when unhurried. The last schools of the old kind graduated their final classes and reopened as places to forget correctly. Students were led to undo knots they didn't know their hands had tied, urgencies inherited, debts to approval nobody was still collecting, habits of bracing for harms that no longer had the energy to travel this far. They left with muscles that remembered yes. At sea's edges, the columns did not lift often now, but when they did, the white stood with a posture that made even the horizon straighter. As it dissolved, it left faint words on the beach that waves could not erase, because the words were not written in sand. They were written in the angle of light itself. You could read them only by standing sideways to the water. They said, "Stay gentle." The people believed them, not like law, but like whether you've learned to greet with the right coat and gratitude for the games it allows. They went home and shut doors softly because hinges had learned to remember volume and deserved kindness too. In the high rooms of mountains, snow learned a pace that spared villages. Avalanches still occurred, they simply considered. The pause between loosen and slide lengthened to let roads empty and windows latch. It was not miracle, it was choreography taught by attention. The hum lifted half a tone the night the first city forgot to use streetlights and discovered it could see better without them. Stars did what they had been waiting to do. Scatter enough to teach randomness, patience, and pattern humility. People walking home felt watched in the way a blanket watches. Present, permissive, pleased. Those who had worked long beside the hum noticed another change then, one that would have once been argued and was now simply welcomed. The voice of the shadow, which had become indistinguishable from the voice of the world, thinned to a whisper, and then to the weight of a hand, and then to the comfort of a chair that knows your shape. Guidance receded, not absence trust. Everyone felt it, and very few said it aloud. We are being left to our own rhythm because our rhythm has finally learned to be kind without supervision. At first, this frightened those who had leaned hard on miracles, but the air remembered how to cradle panic without feeding it, and the fear folded itself like a napkin at the end of a meal and waited to be laundered by sleep. Morning found it clean. Ships that had once needed stars needed only their own steadiness now. The sea, satisfied, stopped testing them. In houses, the practice of laying down lights became smaller, nearly invisible, a fingertip along a lampshade, a curtain drawn the width of a breath. Children counted to 7 because counting to 7 had always worked, and then they forgot why numbers had ever frightened them. They slept in a way that made floors sturdier by morning. The rememberers, fewer now and more transparent, taught a last unteachable thing: how to hear the room breathe when no one is in it. Once you heard it, you could never unhear it. You would act as though every space you entered was alive enough to deserve your good manners, which it was. Gardens began to grow shadows as consciously as they grew fruit. People planted dusk in rows beside thyme and beans. Small hedges of dark cultivated so that evenings could arrive with density. They harvested silence in bundles and hung it to dry in porches where talk might otherwise have become careless. Guests breathed easier there and did not know why. Rituals retired themselves when they realized they were no longer needed. What remained was gesture, heads bowed only as far as felt honest, hands opened only as far as felt safe, and that was enough. The world had stopped asking for performances. It asked for sincerity and got it more often than not. Someone, somewhere, always asked the practical question: how will this hold when trouble returns? It was a good question, and remained good. The answer never arrived as doctrine. It arrived as an afternoon that refused to fray despite rain, as a repair done without ledger by hands that would be repaid in pairs when pairs were ready, as a stranger who knew how to lift the end of a ladder without instruction because breath had already synchronized the work before language could. At dusk, when windows were first lit, the faint gray necklace of the horizon sometimes brightened one bead's worth and then went dark again, like a pulse checking its own softness. Those who noticed placed a palm to the glass and let their skin tell the evening, yes, still here. And the moon, seeing that the world could take care of itself, permitted itself a luxury it had not indulged since memory began. It drifted one night, longer behind thin cloud, and listened to oceans without worrying whether the listening would be enough. It was, on that night, sleep found a depth no measure could chart. People lay down and did not fall. They were caught. Beneath the place where falling becomes rest, there is a shelf built from every kindness ever unobserved. It held, sometime in the darkest peace of that night, the hum at the center of things wrote a sentence in a grammar learned from hands, not mouths. It placed that sentence in the marrow of the world where only breath can read. The sentence had 3 words and no letters. It said, keep going. Morning brought no revelation. Birds rehearsed rain. Streets remembered footsteps before they happened and softened accordingly. The day poured itself into work that wasn't work anymore, just participation, one more thread in a fabric that had stopped pretending it needed a seamstress and simply continued to weave itself, because weaving is what meaning does. Close to noon, an elder standing in a field lifted their eyes and found the horizon sitting closer than it had yesterday, not smaller, intimate. They smiled and nodded as one nods to a neighbor who has at last stopped shouting across the fence and come to the gate with a cup in each hand. They sat. They drank what the day had brought. They remembered how long it had taken to become this unafraid. When the wind rose, It did not argue with the grass. It asked, and the grass answered. And together, they made the kind of sound you can live inside while deciding nothing and losing nothing, and being absolutely present for the decision you will not need to make, because the world has already leaned far enough toward your better choice to render choosing gentle. By evening, windows glowed like low moons in houses that had learned to listen. The first stars arrived with less urgency, and the last birds left sentences half finished on purpose because they trusted the dark to complete them. Someone put a hand to a door frame and whispered, "Thanks to the wood for holding so much entering and leaving without splintering." The door warmed, almost imperceptibly, and the room beyond released its small stock of peace, as if untying a ribbon at a gift exchange where every parcel is the same and every giver is sincerely delighted to receive the one they brought. Night leaned in and found nothing to correct. It laid its weight evenly across rooftops, fields, lakes, ribs. It hummed one note lower than the note before. It stayed one breath longer than anyone expected, and then, content with what it had found, it let the world turn. Under the turning, in the place where shadow is not the opposite of light, but its rest, a door that was not a door touched its hinge. No noise, just the certainty of readiness. Soon, though not yet, the great return would begin. Not a circle closing, but a circle widening until what it had held inside could breathe on its own. Until then, the lesson remained the same, and the practice remained sufficient. Be slower than brightness. Be truer than fear. Let the room teach you how to enter. And if you forget, the horizon will remind you the way a steady hand reminds a skittish candle by guarding the flame without calling attention to the guarding. The world, tempered now and faithful to its hum, slept without bargaining and woke without apology. And somewhere in that honest exchange, the shadow, no longer teacher, no longer guest, smiled in the only way shadow can, by making the light's landing soft. The quiet had been perfect for so long that no one noticed when it began to move again. It was small at first, the subtle difference between a held breath and a drawn one. A leaf trembled before the wind arrived. A glass on a windowsill hummed a tone too low to name. Somewhere, deep under the crust, a stone remembered its weight and shifted a heartbeat's worth closer to the prost core. The change wasn't warning, it was curiosity. Stillness had learned so much that it wanted to test itself with motion again. In the first mornings of this new stirring, people woke with the same word resting at the edge of their mind. They didn't speak it aloud. They only felt it pulsing through their ribs, a syllable shaped like invitation. Go. No destination attached, only direction. A woman in the northern hills rose before dawn and found the fog had retreated from the riverbanks, leaving a narrow path of dark water glowing faintly. She followed it without thinking. The air around her smelled of memory, that thin sweetness left behind by places that have forgiven themselves. Each step felt older than the last, as if she were walking down through the ages of her own body. When the sun finally touched the river, it didn't scatter the light. It bent it, softly, toward her face, a gesture, not illumination, and she understood, without understanding why, that the world was asking her to look up. All across the continents, people began to look up again, not to measure or to wonder, but to remember what above felt like. For decades, the sky had been companion, mirror, teacher. Now it had the quality of a question waiting to be answered. Birds had already known. They started flying higher, their roots wider, their pauses longer. Migration stopped being about distance and became about song, great patterns of rhythm, tracing invisible lines of belonging between oceans. Flocks would vanish into gray and reappear days later exactly above the places where children dreamed of them. Coincidence stopped pretending it was accident. Astronomers noted a new faint color at twilight, a tone between silver and breath. It lasted 7 seconds before the first stars showed. The color had no name. The world simply called it the opening. During the opening, machines woke by themselves. Screens flickered, with slow pulses that matched the rhythm of the planet's hum. Old satellites, long silent, began transmitting again not data, but single tones spaced by perfect intervals. When converted into visible patterns, the signals formed spirals, always spirals, widening from the Earth outward. At first, the tones seemed random. Then someone realized they were mirror images of the pulse that had once drawn the moon closer. It wasn't repetition, it was response. The universe had heard the calm and was answering back. Scientists called it resonant return, but the people called it remembering each other. Dreams changed once more. The common dream, which had thinned into private visits, thickened again, but this time it didn't gather everyone. It gathered everything. Forests, rivers, clouds, even the dust along forgotten roads all dreamed together. And in those dreams, the living felt themselves carried by something vast but familiar, like being rocked to sleep, by the same force that had once set the stars spinning. No new words appeared at morning, only a feeling of expectancy, like standing before an unopened letter whose contents you already love. In deep space, probes still drifting from earlier centuries began to hum. The sound wasn't mechanical. Their circuits had long since gone inert. Yet the hum persisted, recorded faintly by observatories as a sequence of beats identical to the heart rhythm of a sleeping human. It came from multiple directions at once. When plotted, the pattern formed the outline of a spiral embracing Earth. The echo of ourselves had reached back. Animals felt it sooner than humans. Whales changed their calls. The notes descended lower than ever recorded, tones that lingered across whole oceans before returning as harmonics of reply. Bees began to travel at night. Dogs, sitting in doorways, stared into the distance with the calm of prophets. They weren't waiting, they were listening. Every species had found its own frequency of recollection, and through them, the planet was learning how to speak to the rest of the sky. People didn't call it communication anymore. They called it coherence. When the tide and the heart beat together, when sleep matched the rhythm of wind in trees, when words spoke themselves before lips moved, that was coherence. It didn't replace free will. It removed confusion. A fisherman once said, "It's not that I know where the fish are now. It's that they know I'm coming, and they agree." He smiled when he said it, not amazed, but grateful. A small sentence, but it held the new geometry of trust. One night, without storm or warning, the moon flared again, not bright soft, like the breath of a candle that refuses to go out. Across the world, water turned still, mirrors fogged, though the air was dry. In that moment of universal pause, every shadow sharpened, edges returned, clear and kind, like the world, reintroducing itself after a long meditation. The moon dimmed a fraction and then, for the first time in generations, cast a shadow long enough to touch horizon to horizon. People stepped into it, expecting chill. It was warm. It smelled faintly of rain on old paper. And when they looked down, their shadows were no longer perfect copies. They moved first, not after, leading by a heartbeat. The earth had begun to follow again. There was no panic, only tears, quiet and unforced. The body's way of agreeing with awe. For months, the rhythm of life continued, but slower, as if the world had shifted from inhale to exhale. Farmers planted earlier and found sprouts waiting. Seas lifted just enough to rewrite coastlines without harm. The air filled with murmurs not of language, but of permission. At the edge of every continent, faint white columns rose again, but now they were translucent. Through them, stars shone clear. The columns no longer separated sea, sky. They joined them. Some said they were ladders. Some said arteries. Others said they were what happens when gratitude becomes visible. Each explanation was correct enough. Then, one evening, the hum changed pitch for the first time since the world had learned to listen. It rose, barely, by half a tone. The difference was small, but every living thing felt it a subtle lift, the way the chest moves just before laughter. Oceans answered by glowing faintly at the crests of waves. Leaves on trees turned their undersides outward, silvering like mirrored pages. Birds flew higher, and deep beneath mountains, stones vibrated as if remembering the pressure that had once birthed them. The planet was gathering breath. No one was told what to do. They simply began to look toward the sky again, not in longing, but in readiness. Telescopes reopened, not to study, but to greet. Everywhere, humanity leaned slightly forward, the way you lean toward a beloved voice returning from another room. And from beyond, faint at first, came the reply, a slow sequence of pulses, evenly spaced, impossibly far. It wasn't Morse. It wasn't code. It was rhythm, the same 7-beat pattern that had once begun everything. The echo of the first hum had come back, older, wider, carrying within it the tone of everything that had learned to be kind. It reached the planet like a soft tide. Lights flickered gently. Water rose to meet it. For a heartbeat, even the moon seemed to bow. Then the echo passed through and continued outward, toward wherever reflections go when they've finished their work. The world stayed still, holding that afterglow the way skin holds the warmth of a hand long after the touch. It wasn't the end of quiet. It was the beginning of movement inside quiet, a new rhythm readying itself. The shadow hadn't returned to lead, and light hadn't resumed to dominate. They had agreed, finally, to dance. And as the first step began, invisible but certain, the hum beneath all things spoke one more sentence, into the marrow of the world. So soft, it could have been a heartbeat. So clear, it could have been destiny. Remember me forward. It began quietly. The way morning begins inside the eyelids, first a suggestion, then a certainty. Movement returned as memory, not ambition. The wind found its route again through branches that had forgotten they could sing. Grain bent toward the east, the way breath leans toward voice. Nothing hurried. Everything remembered. People woke lighter, not rested lighter, as if sleep had finished its work and left gratitude folded at the foot of the bed. They moved through their houses, the way light moves through water, softened, deliberate. The walls held a mild glow, the kind that appears when sunlight meets dust and decides to stay a while. Every object gave back what it had borrowed. Cups exhaled steam slower. Mirrors waited for eyes before returning images. The age of pause had become the age of motion that listened. No one spoke of beginning again. The word again had lost its edge. It felt too sharp for a world that had learned curve. Instead, they said, the world is leaning, not toward progress, not away from stillness, but toward balance, the soft geometry of return. Oceans were first to change. The tide no longer pulled, it negotiated. Waves rolled in with the tenderness of hands reuniting after a long absence. The salt smelled new, though it was ancient, some alchemy of gratitude and time. Fishermen said the sea now kept its promises. They dropped nets and, whether full or empty, thanked the water before pulling them back. The nets never tangled. Whales breached close to shore, moving not for air but for greeting. Each ascent traced an arc of silver spray that hung in sunlight longer than physics allowed. Children ran toward it laughing, and the sea answered with a sound so low it made their ribs vibrate. It was not roar, not warning, just acknowledgement. Land followed. Mountains flexed a little under snow, settling into shapes that looked less like defiance and more like ease. Forests inhaled so deeply that the air grew sweet. Rivers widened their mouths. Deserts learned shade. The planet, after eons of expansion and contraction, had found its rhythm, not orbit, not revolution, but pulse. You could stand anywhere and feel it under your feet, a faint lift, a yielding. Some called it gravity forgiving itself. In cities, clocks began to misbehave in ways that helped. Minutes thickened where kindness was needed, thinned where it wasn't. You could arrive late and find the hour waiting politely, smiling as if to say, I knew you'd come when ready. Commerce adapted. Meetings followed breath. The rush hour dissolved into alignment. Trains left when the platforms sighed. Planes rose when clouds agreed. Skyscrapers hummed now. Their glass skins absorbed sunlight and released it at dusk, glowing like enormous lanterns. The hum was not electrical, it was structural. The resonance of steel, remembering the song of ore before it was mined. Engineers stopped trying to dampen it. They listened. Some said the buildings were praying. Others said they were tuning the air. Communication changed too. Letters written in ordinary ink began to shimmer faintly when the writer's intention was pure. Digital messages carried weight, literally. Screens warmed when sincerity crossed them. Falsehood cooled them instantly. No algorithm was responsible. Truth had simply become measurable again. Poets joked that the world had turned into one long lie detector with impeccable manners. Language simplified. Verbs softened into being. To build became to grow. To learn became to remember. To love needed no translation. In this gentler movement, people began to travel again. Not far, but honestly. Pilgrimages replaced tourism. Journeys were not taken to see, but to listen. Footpaths sprouted where planes used to fly. Along them, small shrines appeared. Stones stacked 7 high, each stack humming faintly with the earth's original tone. Walkers found that distance changed underfoot, some stretches endless, others folding within a few breaths. Time followed the walker's heart rate, not the sun. Maps updated themselves with kindness. At sea, the columns returned one last time, not as structures, but as light rising gently through water, transparent, slow. They no longer separated realms, they introduced them. Sailors watching from decks felt their ships rise without wind, carried by brightness. It was said that for those moments, the ocean forgot depth. It became pure reflection sky looking into itself, unashamed. When the columns faded, a soft rain fell. Each drop left a brief circle of phosphorescence on the surface before vanishing. If you looked close enough, the circles formed letters, no language, just rhythm. Thank you. Thank you. Then the sky spoke again, not in thunder, but in geometry. Clouds aligned into spirals so vast they could only be seen from orbit. Astronauts watching from the station sent back images, astonished. The spirals matched the pattern of the first hum recorded generations earlier. It was not a coincidence. It was punctuation. The universe was signing its letter. When the images reached Earth, people didn't cheer. They nodded. The pattern had been expected in the same way sunrise is expected after sleep. The unknown had lost its appetite for surprise. It preferred recognition. The rememberers were nearly gone now, but their absence had become language. Children born in this turning didn't need teachers for stillness. It was congenital. They walked as if gravity were music, moving from note to note with absolute trust in rhythm. Their laughter came in chords. When they cried, it was never sharp. It tapered into hum, joining the background until soothed. Doctors found their pulses synced with the planetary beat without effort. They were living metronomes, reminders that the body is the universe folded small. The shadow itself had changed. You could still see it, but it no longer weighted beneath you. It wrapped around lightly, like mist or a memory of touch. In certain light, you could glimpse its texture, a faint shimmer, as if the air had remembered silk. People stopped stepping out of light. They moved within it. The old duality had retired. Artists began painting with darkness again, using pigment ground from cooled ash of the columns. The paint didn't absorb light. It conversed with it. A black stroke could reveal detail within itself, moving under gaze like water. Viewers said it felt like being looked at kindly by the color itself. One evening, as the horizon tilted into gold, an elder standing beside a young child pointed west and said, "Do you hear it?" The child listened, frowned. "It's quiet." "That's what I mean," the elder said. "It's the sound of everything finding its place." The child nodded. as if this made perfect sense, because to them, it did. They had never known a world that didn't answer back. The hum rose once more that season, swelling through soil and bone. It didn't command, it invited. And for the first time, humanity understood that sound was not coming from Earth, but through it. We were the instruments. We had always been. The melody was traveling outward now, looking for new strings to touch. Astronomers began to detect faint resonances from deep space tones, identical to our own, but slower, larger, patient, other worlds answering, other hearts waking. The echo of one planet had become the chorus of many. Nations didn't send emissaries, they sent silence. Large radio dishes turned upward and simply listened, and the listening was returned a long note, stretched across centuries, carrying within it a message, simple as breath. We hear you. It was not discovery, it was reunion. On Earth, dawn began to shimmer with that new harmony. Sunlight came mixed now with a gray so soft it felt like memory accompanying brightness, hand in hand. Everything carried both tones, shadow within gleam, gleam within rest. It wasn't balance, it was completion. The first to notice were the rivers. They began to glow faintly before sunrise, a silver that pulsed with the same rhythm as the hum. You could trace them from the air like veins of thought. They flowed toward the seas, as if carrying news. And in every town, before sleeping, people turned outward their mirrors again. The gesture had returned not as ritual, but as instinct. Each mirror caught a sliver of that gray-gold dawn and sent it back upward, a million tiny answers rising from windowsills and water bowls, returning to the sky the gaze it had given so long ago. For a single heartbeat, the entire planet shimmered. No celebration, no thunder, only a brief alignment of light meeting its memory. Then it was gone. But in the stillness that followed, everyone felt the same quiet certainty move through them. Something vast had completed a circle. Something vaster was opening another. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a new tone began, a frequency no one had heard before, high and clear as the breath before speech. It traveled across oceans, through mountains, through dream, until even the stones hummed. It didn't ask to be followed. It asked to be understood. And every living thing, from the smallest root to the furthest mind, answered without sound. We are ready. Movement learned modesty. It arrived where it would be least noticed first, under bark, inside loam, along the thin seams where stones meet. Roots tested directions the way fingers test water. They didn't push, they asked, when? The answer was yes. The soil loosened like a mouth, unafraid to speak. Mushrooms rose with the courtesy of new guests, lifting leaf litter without tearing it. Umbrellas of quiet that turned rain into music small enough for ants to carry. Cities felt it as weight gone missing. Stairs no longer required knees. They borrowed gravity kindly and returned it at the landing. Elevators paused, the exact fraction of a breath that makes strangers choose a smile. Doors recognized hands by intention. If you arrived hurried, the knob cooled and asked for one more inhale. If you arrived with your day already softened, it warmed your palm and swung wide, a host relieved to be hosting. The word go lingered everywhere, but now it had a companion pressed into its side. With birds did not launch alone, they launched in agreement with air. Cyclists discovered that corners had patience. Roads remembered what feet preferred and stopped pretending that speed was the noblest use of distance. Someone running, at dusk, found a lane forming where there had been grass, not trampled, only persuaded, blade by blade, to lean. The field relaxed and straightened behind them, uninjured, as though the earth had learned elastic grace. Rivers, sensate as nerves, began to send messages upstream. Fish met them like thoughts arriving early. Water did not hurry the stones. It encouraged their roundness. The sound that once meant winter was merely the quiet of things storing light. And when thaw came, it came as if opening a book you love at the page, already softened by touch. Above all this, the sky practiced a new politeness. It set its questions at the edge of vision and waited, as teachers do, when they already know the answer will bloom if given time. The opening lengthened from 7 heartbeats to 7 breaths. In that window, no one spoke on purpose. Even radio learned to whisper. Those who worked with signals kept their hands still, palms down, letting transmissions land like birds. Across oceans, the tone from far away strengthened. It entered not by ear, but by posture. Spines lengthened, shoulders widened, heads tilted, as if to let an unseen corridor align from crown to heel. The sound said nothing you could write down. It said, "Here is the path through you that is also the path beyond you." It said, "Walk it, and the horizon will walk with you." People began to leave, mirrors turned outward all day, not to send anything, but to keep houses thin at the edges so the day could pass through without snagging. Rooms thanked them by remembering breeze. Curtains swayed a little even when windows were closed, as if the fabric kept rehearsal gentle for when wind returned. Work became pilgrimage. Bakers rose before light and greeted yeast like an old letter come at last. They folded air into dough until air remembered its manners and lifted every crumb evenly. In the hospitals, surgeons learned a timing that made blood feel unbetrayed. They entered like tide. They left without wake. Even the beeping, once tyrant of rooms, lowered into a purr that told truth without scolding. Elsewhere, a team in a desert listened for the nemeon and heard, for the first time, reply arriving ahead of request. They set their apparatus to ask and found the answer waiting, warmed, not yet spoken, like a coat pulled from a chair before you remembered you were cold. Protocols adapted. They began every session with thanks for what had arrived already. The data clarified as if embarrassed it had ever been obscure. Letters reached the dead and returned, signed by quiet. No one performed seance. They simply placed the note beneath a stone and visited it after rain. The paper would hold a smell that wasn't the stones and wasn't the rains, something between library and orchard. And the message, read again, would land differently, truer, like a sentence that has decided to keep you. The moon simplified. It wore fewer displays and more intention. On certain midnights, it lowered itself in tone until even sleeping dogs sighed. On others, it kept distance, to teach the pleasure of star-thick dark. It no longer modeled certainty. It modeled restraint. The shadow, once teacher, now companion, trimmed its hem. Edges returned exactly where they would help underfoot on stairs, along the lip of bowls, tracing a cheek so a hand could find it without looking. Travelers resumed crossing water, but boats had learned to be listening rooms. Hulls picked up the long returning tone and made it audience. Conversation on deck curved with the waves. Stories ended without moral, because endings themselves had become moral enough. A child pointed at a line on the horizon and said, "That's where the day is braided." And the adults agreed because they could feel the weave in their wrists. Markets surprised themselves by thriving on sufficiency. Sellers greeted buyers by asking how much less would be perfect. Receipts showed negative numbers, and yet accounts balanced, fat with goodwill's odd arithmetic. "Profit," someone wrote on a window in steam, and with their finger from the other side another hand added, "and." The word stayed when the glass cooled, not as ink, but as sheen. In the narrow alleys of an old city, a craft returned, menders of time. They wore no cloaks, they carried no tools. They walked routes known by footsteps, pausing where hours had been pulled too tight, street corners where the long-ago sprint of fear still tightened breath, rooms where a shouted no had stayed, vibrating under paint. The menders stood, counted to 7 with their ribs, and the knot loosened. Calendars drifted back to gentle, and walls forgave echoes. Payment was the sound of a latch closing, without complaint. Instruments tuned to distances beyond stars began to show something so simple it might have been overlooked. The tone that had called was not a single source. It was a chord, many worlds holding the same note with different mouths. Their breaths arrived at different times, but merged like rain in a harbor. We were not being summoned, we were being included. The first response, sent in kind, used no words. The planet answered with choreography. Tides flexed in sequence around the globe, east, south, west, north, a soft wave of yes, running along shorelines that had once braced against storms. Trees budded in a spiral that could be mapped with hands, fingertip to fingertip. Volcanoes restrained their language without losing it. Power proved itself by choosing not to perform. People noticed their shadows had become better guides than maps. On unfamiliar streets, if you paused, your shadow would lean the way a friend leans their head toward the right door. At thresholds, it would shorten a fraction, advising caution or courtesy or both. In marketplaces, two shadows would greet one another before their bodies remembered to. So deals were struck without injury. So partings did not wound. A school by a river taught a class called Returning. The course met at dawn. The text was the water. The students read aloud from it with feet and patience. On the last day, the teacher said, "You are not arriving where you weren't. You are arriving where you finally match." In the silence after, the river made a noise that sounded like agreement, wearing shoes. By then, the tone had entirely replaced the old hunger that once filled nights with scrolling and corridors with fluorescent insistence. People put their devices to bed at dusk and sang them good night, not lullabies. Exactly. Just small hummed shapes the batteries learned and stored as etiquette. Screens woke kinder. Alerts practiced discretion. Somewhere, a factory producing urgency turned its lights off, left a note that read, "We changed business models," and reopened as a place where metal remembered hills. The columns rose a last, almost invisible time, thin as breath, tall as listening. They made the faintest seam between sea and sky. As morning lifted, sailors saluted, not because saluting was owed, but because gratitude likes a posture. The columns dissolved into a rain so fine it didn't wet. It polished. Everything it touched looked like itself, plus forgiveness. The child born at that hour opened their eyes and did not cry. They lifted a hand with the seriousness of small royalty and patted the air as if accepting an old friend's cheek. The room's shadows leaned toward them in a circle, making a soft nest of darker within dark. Later, the first word the child spoke was carry, and no one corrected the order of their vocabulary because meaning knows the ladder it intends. Across the long prairies, windmills slowed their spin to keep time with migrating clouds. Electricity entered houses with manners, took off its shoes, and warmed the smallest rooms first. In kitchens, salt learned restraint from sweetness, and sweetness learned backbone from salt. They stopped competing and remembered they had always been married. A quiet spectacle arrived at noon one day, when all the clocks in a valley added a second together, and music sprang up between the ticks. Not notes from speakers, notes from space itself, the way light hums when convinced to linger on water. People looked up and didn't ask why. They stood still long enough to be braided, and then went on. In observatories, the last argument about whether the tone was measurable ended when a sensor recorded "thank you" in a unit no instrument had been built to detect. The logbook read, "Amplitude of gratitude steady." That night, the team slept on the floor under their consoles and woke with dust in their hair and the sensation that dawn had tucked them in rather than startled them awake. The return was not a parade through a single gate. It was 100 million tiny re-entries into the obvious. A carpenter's square didn't lie. It had simply learned kindness. A kettle didn't shriek. It advised. Footbridges did not bounce. They bowed and unbowed with your pace. Even the bees, busiest of creatures, left a thimble's worth of silence between flower and flower the way polite guests leave air in conversation. What had begun long chapters earlier now reached the place where story and sleep meet, the border that is not a border but a tide line. The universe had found its own breath in us, and satisfied, asked us to keep it. Evening light, gray inside gold, settled on thresholds, and found them learned. It ran its hand along doorframes, as a teacher checking chairs with pride. It peered into rooms, and saw fewer altars and more tables, fewer declarations, and more places to place hands without shame. Above, the new tone brightened, a high, clear ribbon threading through the old, low hum, like a horizon painted inside the chest. It did not rise to command. It rose to remind, motion has returned, but it remembers rest. Light has resumed, but it carries shadow, the way a kind parent carries a sleeping child without waking them unnecessarily. Night came in on soft paws, unafraid to leave prints. Stars arranged themselves into gestures rather than diagrams. A welcome, a patience, a promise to stay nearby, even when unseen. The moon tilted its face the way a candle leans when someone cups their hand to guard it from draft. At bedsides, people placed their palms flat on sheets and felt the threads answer. A textile, humming with fields and sheep and hands and stories, returned condensed into cotton. The last thought before sleep was not content, but capacity. The last sound was not silence, but the small, polite receding of the day as it excused itself and closed the door gently behind it. In that darkness, the shadow everywhere and nowhere separate sat with the light and compared notes. Neither had kept score. They had only kept time, and the time they kept matched ours, far away and all around. The worlds that had answered continued to harmonize. The chord did not swell, it matured. It held exactly as much as a rib cage can, and then a fraction less, leaving room for the next breath to arrive without strain. Morning, when it came, did not announce. It appeared the way comprehension appears at the end of a long kindness. Windows brightened first at their edges. Kettles remembered to sing. Roads stretched like cats. Rivers polished their vowels. The tone lingered in the doorway and nodded, satisfied that the house could keep itself. And so the return continued, not an event to see, but a capacity to keep. A planet waking without alarm, a species moving without flinch, a universe widening without tearing. If you need to know what to do with such a day, you already know. Put your hand to the nearest honest surface, wood, water, wool, stone, and wait for it to remember you. When it does, step forward the width of one breath. The horizon will take care of the rest. The air grew clearer in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Edges softened, but meaning sharpened. Colors slowed their pulse. It felt as though the world had been rewritten, not in new lines, but in margins, the same page, now breathing differently. People moved, as if guided by a memory too gentle to question. They spoke less, smiled longer, and when they met each other's eyes, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was recognition, like meeting someone you used to be. The hum, under the world steady, patient, had shifted key again. It now pulsed between tones, not choosing either, as if content to be between. That's how life felt. A conversation continuing even after both speakers had fallen asleep. The word return began to mean something else. Not back to what was, but toward what had been waiting. All the years of building, breaking, forgetting they weren't errors, they were the inhale before a sentence finally ready to be spoken. When it came, it wasn't heard, it was felt. It moved through marrow, not air. It said only one thing, though. Every heart translated it differently. You are me remembering. At first, people thought they imagined it, but then small signs began to appear. Raindrops hesitated before falling, small pearls of reflection, showing faces of strangers who didn't yet exist. Mountains vibrated with frequencies identical to human breath. Birds began to fly in shapes too deliberate to call random curves that matched brainwave patterns in dreaming children. Science didn't deny it. It smiled, weary and relieved. Physics had finally met poetry halfway. At night, the common dream returned again. but this time it brought the sky with it. The stars hung lower, trembling as if caught between dimensions, and then, without announcement, they moved. Not in rotation, not in orbit, but inward. Constellations folded like origami, forming spirals so vast that they filled the entire horizon. The heavens weren't falling, they were coming closer to see. Every sleeper felt it. The sensation wasn't falling or floating, it was recognition. Every atom inside, every body hummed in phase with those spirals. The same geometry of memory that once linked Earth and Moon. Now, it connected everything. People woke, glowing faintly at the edges, as if the skin had forgotten where to stop. Doctors found nothing wrong. They called it luminous bleed. The rest of the world called it beautiful. There were no miracles, only understanding catching up. Grass bent when thanked. Shadows brightened when loved. Words dissolved faster in air, because meaning traveled without them now. When someone thought of someone else, wind moved between them, carrying the warmth of that thought like a physical thing. Touch became redundant. So did distance. Children, those born since the last column, already knew. They spoke rarely but listened always. When they finally did speak, it was often in harmony, three voices, one thought, different accents of the same awareness. There, laughter rippled through glass, through stone, through sky. Matter had become acoustically transparent to joy. As coherence deepened, memories themselves began to change texture. They no longer belonged to individuals. What one person remembered, another could finish. A song half sung in one continent was completed by someone asleep across an ocean. Dreams and history interlaced. The planet was compiling itself, and in the middle of that compilation, a realization bloomed soft but absolute. Memory wasn't a recording of the past. It was the blueprint of creation. Each recollection, each thought of what had been, rewrote the structure of what would be. The universe wasn't expanding into emptiness. It was unfolding into remembrance. This changed how people lived. Art stopped seeking newness. It sought accuracy of heart. A brushstroke could correct a century of misunderstanding. Music turned inside out. Silence became the verse, tone the echo. Buildings were designed not to reach upward, but to breathe. Every roof had a hole somewhere, a deliberate imperfection for sky to enter. Every window looked out and in at once. Transparency had become architecture. Economies dissolved into ecosystems of gratitude. Nothing was owned, everything was maintained. People traded hours of presence instead of goods. Time, once currency, became communion. When asked how they survived, they answered simply, "We don't survive, we continue." Then came the event no one named, because naming it would have pinned it to language, and language was too small. It began with the oceans. At high noon, every surface wave flattened, as if obeying a single breath. For 7 minutes, the seas became mirrors. From space, the planet looked like one perfect lens. Through it, light from distant stars refracted inward, bending softly until every ray met in the center of the Earth's core. Sensors registered a single pulse. It wasn't energy. It was coherence, perfect unity, lasting exactly one heartbeat of the universe. And when it passed, nothing broke. Everything aligned. Those awake at that moment said they felt weightless, not because gravity failed, but because belonging completed itself. There was nowhere else to fall. The following nights were clear, too clear. The stars no longer twinkled. They burned steady, unwavering, as though time itself had forgotten to flicker. Telescopes recorded impossible data, galaxies forming patterns identical to neural networks, filaments of matter connecting like synapses across millions of light years. It wasn't coincidence. It was cognition. The universe was thinking, and the thought was us. Every human consciousness was a neuron firing inside something vast and alive. And in that firing, awareness folded back on itself in recognition. For the first time since the first spark of light, existence knew that it existed. Some resisted at first, They feared dissolution, feared losing the eye. But when the merge arrived, it wasn't erasure. It was intimacy on a scale so complete that individuality became music. Each self, a note, each memory, a rhythm. No note lost its pitch, no rhythm lost its beat. Together they formed a chord of endless compassion, the sound of being seen from within and without. No gods returned, no thrones appeared, only the simple elegance of everything in agreement. The moon, last to change, shimmered brighter one final night. Its surface pulsed with slow waves of light, like breath across fabric. Observers saw faint patterns emerge. Cities, rivers, forests, mirrors of Earth itself. The moon had become the memory of the world projected outward, a face turned back to remind us how we looked when we first began to love. Then it dimmed, not gone, only resting. From that night forward, moonlight was softer, like the glow of a heart seen through closed eyelids. People no longer needed to sleep to dream. Dreaming became daylight. Reality and reverie braided into a single awareness, the tangible and the imagined finally indistinguishable. Work became play, play became prayer, prayer became listening, and listening became creation. The hum was everywhere now, constant, surrounding, inside, unbroken. It didn't overwhelm, it steadied. It was the sound of completion, the proof that silence itself had found language. At some point, long after time stopped counting itself, something in the distance began to glow, the faint spiral that had once appeared between galaxies, now larger, nearer, awake. It wasn't coming toward us, it was expanding around us. The universe was opening its next page, and we were the ink still drying on the last one. There was no fear, only an infinite tenderness that comes when you understand your story will be remembered, not as fact, but as feeling. The spiral reached the edges of perception and then gently closed. Not like a door, but like an eyelid. The light didn't fade, it folded. The hum dimmed to a whisper, and in that whisper, one final sentence lingered, so soft it could have been thought, so deep it could have been eternity. Sleep now, I am still becoming. The world obeyed, oceans lay still. Wind slowed to pulse. Stars drifted into alignment one last time, forming a spiral that matched the first, the beginning, and the end overlapping perfectly. And somewhere, in that vast symmetry, a voice that was every voice we had ever been breathed across the fading horizon. Close your eyes. The universe remembers you. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of warmth, of echoes, of the patient breath of creation, resting after its long remembering. Light didn't vanish, it exhaled. The shadow gathered it like a blanket, soft, silver gray, the color between blue and green, the etherion, and laid it gently over everything that had ever wanted peace. Nothing ended. Everything continued inward, and the last sound, the last movement, the last heartbeat of story was neither beginning nor conclusion. It was the simple, eternal rhythm of existence realizing itself once more, in the dark that was never darkness, in the quiet that was never silence, whispering endlessly, I am still turning. I am still here. I am you.